Chapter 1. The Mafia's Hidden Empire. It begins not in a back room, not in the shadows of New York, but in the silence of a forgotten American street. A man in a fedora steps out of a smoky bar. He looks ordinary, just another working man heading home. But under his coat rests the empire of an underworld that will soon control cities, unions, and even politicians. No headlines announce his presence. No policeman raises a hand to stop him. Yet his quiet stride speaks louder than any gunfire. The invisible army has already begun its march. To understand the day the Mafia was exposed, you first need to understand how it grew so powerful in plain sight. It didn't begin with a single explosion or bloody street war. It began with something as ordinary as thirst. Prohibition in the 1920s turned liquor into gold. Suddenly, a bottle of whiskey was worth more than a briefcase of cash, and men who had once struggled on the margins of immigrant neighborhoods became millionaires overnight. They smuggled, bribed, and fought, but most of all, they adapted. They understood the hunger of the American public, and they fed it. In those years, organized crime was like a tree sprouting from poisoned soil. Every city became its own root system. Chicago with Capone, New York with Luchiano, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston. But unlike the flashy gangsters Hollywood would later immortalize, most of the men pulling strings didn't want their names in lights. They wanted silence, invisibility. Think of it like a spider web stretched across an entire nation. Delicate, nearly invisible, but strong enough to snare anyone who stumbled across it. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, many assumed the Mafia would collapse. The golden river of bootlegging had dried up. But those who thought that were mistaken. The men in charge had tasted real power, and they weren't about to give it up. They moved into gambling, unions, construction, narcotics, and loan sharking. Every working man who needed a paycheck, every small business that needed protection, every crooked politician who needed votes, all became threads in the Mafia's expanding web. The brilliance of their system was its silence. On the surface, America saw businessmen in suits, immigrants running local clubs, labor leaders speaking about workers' rights. But behind the curtain, these same men held meetings in smoke-filled rooms, their fingers drumming over ledgers filled with names and numbers that could buy or bury a man. To the average citizen, the Mafia was a ghost story, a whisper, something told in taverns late at night, but never confirmed by daylight. The myth of invisibility became their greatest weapon. A politician could shake hands with a man whose smile looked friendly, never realizing that the same hand had signed off on a killing the night before. A police captain could look away from suspicious trucks unloading in the dark, telling himself it was just business. Invisibility meant protection. It meant the empire could grow without anyone daring to call it by its true name. And yet, cracks were already forming. In the 1930s, a young gangster named Lucky Luchiano began dreaming of something larger. He saw the endless street wars as foolish, wasteful. He imagined the Mafia as a corporation, structured, disciplined, nationwide. Luciano's creation of the Commission in 1931 changed everything. For the first time, bosses from different cities sat at the same table, not as rivals, but as partners. They would divide territories, settle disputes, and maintain peace. If the Mafia had been a storm before, Luciano turned it into a government, silent, ruthless, efficient. Still, the secrecy held. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, denied its existence outright. Hoover called it a myth, a Hollywood creation. Even as bodies piled up and fortunes were made, official Washington insisted there was no such thing as a nationwide Mafia. And in a way, that denial was a gift. It allowed the men in charge to operate under a cloak of invisibility more powerful than any weapon. If the government refused to acknowledge them, who would dare to look closer? Picture this: a quiet little town in upstate New York. Cows in the fields, kids riding their bikes, neighbors waving hello. Nothing dangerous, nothing suspicious. But on one November afternoon in 1957, something happened here that blew the lid off America's darkest secret. Expensive Cadillacs started rolling in one after another. Men in sharp suits stepped out, and before long, this sleepy town was crawling with some of the most powerful gangsters in the world. What followed looked less like a mafia meeting and more like a comedy sketch gone wrong. Mob bosses sprinting through muddy fields in $1,000 shoes, ducking behind hedges, crashing into fences, trying desperately to escape. But there was nothing funny about it, because in that chaos, for the very first time, law enforcement had proof that the mafia wasn't just rumor or Hollywood fantasy. It was real, organized, and running the country from the shadows. This was the Appalachin Meeting, the day the mafia was finally exposed. And what went down here would change the mob, and America, forever. The ordinary citizen never saw the deal struck in smoke-filled diners at 3 in the morning. They never heard the hushed conversations in barbershops or candy stores, where men in sharp suits leaned in close, whispering about shipments and percentages. But those conversations shaped entire industries. Unions were bent like metal under heat. Shipping yards moved at the nod of a capo. Politicians found envelopes slid across tables, heavy with cash. America's great machine hummed forward, and buried deep in its gears was the mafia, unseen but essential. But invisibility came at a price. When you live like a ghost, you must be certain no one can trace your steps. The bosses drilled their men on silence. Omerta, the code of silence, wasn't just a rule, it was a religion. Break it, and you weren't just betraying the family. You were signing your own death certificate. Men who talked disappeared. Bodies found in trunks were warnings written in blood. Fear was the glue that held the empire together. Yet fear alone wasn't enough. The mafia thrived on trust too. Trust between families, trust between soldiers and bosses, trust that every man would play his part without bringing the whole house down. They built an empire on loyalty, but loyalty was fragile. And by the 1950s, with new fortunes to be made and old scores unsettled, loyalty was about to be tested in ways no one expected. Imagine America at that moment. Post-war prosperity had filled the suburbs with neat houses and shiny cars. Television flickered in living rooms, promising a new, safe, clean American dream. But beneath that dream, in the alleys of Brooklyn and the backrooms of Chicago, another dream pulsed. One built on gambling parlors, drug shipments, and silent threats. To the surface world, this dream didn't exist. To those inside it, it was everything. The mafia's invisibility was so complete that even those who dealt with them daily sometimes doubted the scale of what they were part of. A union man thought he was just taking advice from a friend. A small business owner believed the extra envelope he paid every month was just insurance. They didn't see themselves as pawns on a chessboard that stretched from coast to coast. But they were. And every move was calculated by men whose names they would never hear. Still, no empire can remain invisible forever. Sooner or later, the weight of its secrets presses too hard against the walls. By the mid-1950s, whispers began to slip through the cracks. Senators questioned the sudden rise of certain men. Journalists noticed the expensive cars parked outside social clubs. And ordinary citizens began to wonder if the mafia was truly just a story told to scare children, or if it was in fact the shadow government running their neighborhoods. The men in power sensed this pressure. Some grew more careful. Others, like Vito Genovese, grew more ambitious. To Genovese, invisibility was useful, but recognition was power. He wanted to step from the shadows into the throne room, to declare himself the undisputed boss of bosses. That ambition would soon drag the entire hidden empire into the light. But before we reach that November day in Appalachin, you need to understand one thing. The mafia didn't rise because America was weak. It rose because America looked the other way. It rose because ambition, fear, and greed are not foreign invaders. They are part of the human heart. And when you mix those ingredients with secrecy, you don't just get criminals. You get an empire that can hide in plain sight. So picture again that man in the fedora, walking down a quiet American street. To his neighbors, he is nothing more than another immigrant chasing the dream. To his associates, he is a soldier in a war without flags. To himself, he is part of something greater, something eternal. His steps are light, but his shadow stretches across an entire nation. And though no one can see it yet, those shadows are about to collide with daylight in the most unexpected way. Because in a quiet town in upstate New York, the invisible empire is about to stumble. Its leaders, drunk on power and blind to the risk, will gather in one place, believing their silence still protects them. But silence cannot hide the sound of too many engines roaring up a country road. And invisibility cannot save you when daylight finally catches your name. The empire thought it was untouchable. The world thought it was a myth. But myths have a way of unraveling when one thread is pulled. And soon, that thread would be tugged by an unassuming state trooper who refused to look away. The story of the Appalachin Meeting doesn't begin with sirens. It begins with shadows. And already, those shadows were growing restless. Chapter 2. Luchiano's Blueprint. The room was thick with smoke, the kind that clung to your clothes and stung your eyes. Men leaned back in their chairs, hats tilted low, glasses of whiskey sweating on the table in front of them. On the surface, it looked like a gathering of tired workers blowing off steam after a long day. But in truth, this was the beating heart of a revolution. The voices were hushed, but the ideas being traded carried enough weight to shape decades of American history. And at the center of it all sat a man named Charles Lucky Luchiano, a visionary who saw what no one else could. He believed the Mafia could be more than just a collection of brawling street gangs. He believed it could be an empire. To understand the Appalachin Meeting of 1957, you must first understand Luchiano's blueprint. Without his design, there would have been no empire to expose, no national network to collapse in panic on that fateful November day. Before Luchiano, organized crime in America was powerful, yes, but it was fractured. Picture a chessboard with too many kings and no rules. Bosses fought each other constantly for territory. Blood spilled on the streets, not because of survival, but because of pride. The gangs were like wild dogs fighting over scraps, snarling and snapping without realizing they could feast together. Luchiano wanted to change that. He wanted order. He wasn't the first to dream of power, but he was the first to understand that power demanded structure. He looked at the violence of the 1920s, the wars between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the countless murders in New York, Chicago, and beyond, and he saw waste. Too many men were dying, too much money was being lost. He once said, in his own cold way, that blood was bad for business. And for a man like Luchiano, business was everything. Luchiano's genius lay in seeing crime as something bigger than fear and intimidation. He treated it like a corporation. Imagine Wall Street, but instead of stock certificates, the currency was gambling dens, speakeasies, and narcotic shipments. He wanted a board of directors, a chain of command, a system that could outlive any one man. And so, in the early 1930s, Luchiano did the unthinkable. He removed the old guard. Both Masuria and Maranzano, two titans of the old Mafia world, were eliminated. Their deaths were not just killings. They were executions of an outdated order, a system too clumsy and violent to survive in a modern America. From their ashes, Luchiano built something new. He called it the Commission. It was, in essence, a governing council of crime families, designed to settle disputes and prevent the kind of street wars that drew police attention. Each family boss had a seat, and decisions were made collectively. The commission was democracy twisted into something darker, but it worked. For the first time, the Mafia was united not by fear, but by shared interest. But Luchiano's blueprint went further. He broke down the rigid hierarchies imported from Sicily, where bosses ruled like medieval lords. Instead, he introduced a more flexible model: bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, capos, soldiers. Each man knew his role, his responsibilities, his limits. It was discipline born of necessity. With this structure, families could grow larger, spread farther, and still maintain loyalty. And loyalty was the cornerstone. If you were inside the life, you weren't just working a job. You were serving a cause. Soldiers bled for their families, believing that one day they, too, might rise higher in the ranks. Capos managed crews like managers in a factory, ensuring every man brought in money, that every scheme ran smoothly. At the top, the bosses reaped the rewards, but they also carried the weight of responsibility, knowing that a single wrong decision could unravel everything. And then there was the code, omerta, silence. To Luchiano, it was the glue that held the structure together. Without silence, the machine would collapse under the weight of exposure. Every man was reminded daily that his tongue could kill him faster than any bullet. It was a chilling discipline, but it worked. Decades passed with the Mafia moving like shadows, its influence growing while the public remained largely unaware. Luchiano also understood something else: alliances. He didn't see Italian blood as the only ticket to power. He reached out to Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, to Irish enforcers, to anyone who could expand the network. It was radical for its time, breaking away from the tribal mindset of the old Mafia, and it made the organization stronger. By embracing outsiders, Luchiano transformed the Mafia from a cluster of ethnic gangs into a true syndicate, one that could stretch across every major city in America. Every racket became a division of the corporation. Gambling was one branch, narcotics another, labor racketeering yet another. Prohibition may have ended, but the Mafia's hunger for profit only grew. They moved into construction, trucking, restaurants, even entertainment. And each move was calculated, guided by the Commission's oversight. Conflicts were settled in meetings, not with Tommy guns on street corners. To outsiders, it looked like crime had quieted. But in truth, crime had grown more powerful than ever. It had simply learned how to hide. This was Luciano's gift and his curse. He had taken chaos and given it order. He had taken thugs and turned them into businessmen. But the more sophisticated the system became, the more dangerous it was. Like a shadow government, it reached into unions, controlled entire industries, and had politicians on payroll. The Mafia wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And all of this was built on one man's vision, one man's willingness to step beyond tradition. Luchiano himself didn't stay in America to see it fully flourish. In 1936, he was convicted and sentenced to prison. Later, during World War II, his influence behind bars was used to aid the U.S. Navy, securing docks against sabotage. For that, his sentence was commuted, but he was deported to Italy. From afar, his blueprint lived on, carried out by the men he left behind. By the 1950s, Luchiano was gone from American soil, but his shadow lingered. The commission he created still ruled, the structure still held. Men like Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and Joseph Bonanno played by the rules Luchiano had written. Every decision they made traced back to his vision of an organized, nationwide syndicate. The Mafia was no longer a rumor. It was an empire, but one so well hidden that many in law enforcement still refused to admit it existed. The genius of Luciano's system was its invisibility. No single man called himself boss of bosses. Power was distributed, balanced, hidden behind layers of respect and protocol. Families operated like branches of a tree, each strong on its own, but connected to the same trunk. And that trunk, the commission, was what kept the tree alive. Yet within this system lay the seeds of downfall. When power is shared, ambition never sleeps. Men like Genovese wanted more than a seat at the table. They wanted the entire table. Luciano's blueprint had given them the tools to build an empire, but it also gave them the means to betray one another without tearing down the whole structure. The Mafia could survive bosses falling, wars erupting, betrayals whispered in the dark. It was designed to endure. But in its resilience, it also created arrogance. By the mid-1950s, the Mafia was so confident in its invisibility that it believed even a gathering of dozens of bosses in one place could remain secret. Luchiano had built a system to keep the Mafia alive forever. What he hadn't accounted for was human pride. Pride would undo everything. Imagine the arrogance it took to believe you could summon over 100 mob figures from across the country to a single estate in upstate New York without anyone noticing. Imagine the confidence it required to think the world would keep looking away, even as Cadillacs and Lincolns rolled down quiet country roads. That arrogance was born of Luchiano's success. His system had worked so well for so long that the men who inherited it believed themselves untouchable. And so, in November of 1957, when the cars pulled into Apalachin, when the most powerful men in the underworld shook hands on Joseph Barber's lawn, they were following Luchiano's blueprint to its natural conclusion. A national network, united, strong, invisible. At least, they thought it was invisible. But invisibility, once pierced, becomes exposure. And exposure is deadly. The same system that allowed the Mafia to rise would, in time, be the same system that brought it crashing down under the glare of police lights and flashing cameras. Luchiano had built the empire, but he had also unknowingly written the script for its most humiliating scene. The blueprint promised power, stability, invisibility. But no plan survives forever. No empire remains hidden in the shadows once the light finds it. And in Appalachin, the light was about to shine brighter than ever before. The men who gathered there believed they were invincible. They believed Luchiano's blueprint had secured them eternal power. But all it would take was one state trooper, one suspicious glance, and one decision to investigate, and the empire would be dragged from the shadows into the harsh, undeniable light of day. The commission still sat like a silent parliament, dictating terms to its families. Soldiers still collected money on corners. Capos still nodded in approval. Bosses still dreamed of more. But outside those walls, America was watching. Journalists were sniffing around. Senators were asking questions. Citizens were growing uneasy. The myth of invisibility was cracking, slowly, faintly, but undeniably. And that is where the story turns. The empire Luchiano built, designed to remain unseen, was about to stumble into history's spotlight. The quiet shadow government, ruling unseen for decades, was about to trip on its own pride. And the man who once preached that blood is bad for business would watch from exile as the business he built became soaked in the blood of its own arrogance. Luchiano's blueprint was brilliant, but brilliance can blind. And in the silence of Appalachin's country roads, the sound of engines approaching carried a warning the bosses could not hear. Invisibility had its limits, and those limits were about to be tested. The empire stood tall, its roots buried deep, its branches spread wide. But even the strongest tree can be felled if someone dares to cut into its trunk. And soon, the axe was coming. Chapter 3. The Post-War Mafia Boom. The war had ended, and America was celebrating. Soldiers returned home, parades filled the streets, factories shifted from tanks to cars, and a new middle class began to blossom. The 1940s closed with an air of optimism, a belief that the world had entered an age of peace and prosperity. But while Americans bought shiny appliances and dreamed of white picket fences, another story was unfolding just beneath the surface. The Mafia, already powerful, already entrenched, was entering its golden age. And in this post-war boom, it would grow so vast and so wealthy that even the shadows struggled to contain it. Picture the mood of America in 1946. Cities pulsed with energy. Neon signs blinked on Broadway. The hum of jukeboxes filled diners across the country. But in the back rooms of those same diners, deals were being made. Beneath the laughter of young couples in movie theaters, envelopes stuffed with cash changed hands. Organized crime had always thrived in chaos, during Prohibition, during the Depression. But in peace, in prosperity, it thrived even more. The Mafia understood something most Americans didn't yet realize. Where there is money, there is opportunity. And post-war America was drowning in money. For returning soldiers, the dream was stability, a steady job, a safe home, a family. For the Mafia, the dream was expansion. Every booming industry, construction, shipping, trucking, entertainment, was a ripe field to be harvested. Men who had once relied on bootlegging now poured their muscle into controlling unions. They recognized that if you could control labor, you could control entire cities. A strike at a shipping dock, a slowdown at a construction site, a disruption at a trucking company. These weren't just inconveniences. They were leverage. And the Mafia learned to wield that leverage like a weapon. Consider the docks of New York. Ships carrying everything from food to steel to oil arrived daily, and every crate had to be unloaded by men who sweated for hours on end. Those men belonged to unions, and those unions answered, quietly, to the Mafia. If a company paid, business flowed smoothly. If it didn't, goods sat on ships, workers refused to unload, and losses mounted. It was extortion disguised as labor rights. To the average worker, the Mafia was invisible. To the bosses of those companies, it was a hand around their throats. But labor was only one piece of the puzzle. Gambling had always been the lifeblood of organized crime, and after the war, it flourished. Soldiers who had grown used to the adrenaline of combat returned home seeking thrills. Casinos, betting parlors, and bookies offer them just that. From the racetracks of New York to the backrooms of Chicago, wagers poured in like rivers of cash. And then there was Las Vegas. In the desert, far from the watchful eyes of most authorities, the Mafia saw a city rise from sand. To the public, it was glitz, neon, and entertainment. To the mob, it was a gold mine. Every card flipped, every dice rolled, every showgirl's performance. All of it was money flowing into Mafia pockets. And then came narcotics. For decades, many bosses had resisted the drug trade, calling it dirty, too dangerous, too likely to attract heat from law enforcement. But others, like Vito Genovese, saw opportunity. Heroin shipments from Europe, connections in Cuba, pipelines stretching across the Atlantic, all of it offered profits far beyond what gambling or unions could bring. The drug trade was riskier, yes, but it was also explosive in its rewards. By the late 1940s and early 50s, narcotics had become one of the Mafia's darkest, most profitable businesses. The post-war boom also gave rise to new kings within the underworld. Old faces like Luchiano still loomed in memory, but fresh power was rising. Vito Genovese returned from exile, hungry to reclaim his throne. Carlo Gambino, quiet and calculating, was building his influence piece by piece. Joseph Bonanno maintained a careful, almost gentlemanly image, while strengthening his family's reach. Stefano Megadino ruled Buffalo like a king. In Chicago, the outfit remained a juggernaut, its reach stretching from Illinois to Hollywood. These men weren't just gangsters. They were industrialists of crime, overseeing empires that rivaled legitimate corporations. And the government? It still looked away. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, clung to his denial that a national crime syndicate even existed. He spoke of hoodlums, of local gangs, but refused to acknowledge the Mafia as an organized entity. Some whispered that Hoover's obsession with communism blinded him to the mob. Others suggested he feared the Mafia might expose secrets about him if pressed too hard. Whatever the reason, his silence was the Mafia's shield. With the nation's top cop pretending they didn't exist, the mob expanded with impunity. But not everyone was blind. A handful of journalists dug into suspicious connections. Some senators, like Estes Kefauver, began holding hearings, dragging the shadows into flickering light. Television cameras captured mobsters squirming in suits, refusing to answer questions, their silence as damning as any confession. Yet even then, many Americans remained skeptical. The Mafia was still a whisper, still a rumor. The truth was too enormous, too dark, for most to accept. And so the Mafia lived in two worlds. In one world, the post-war American dream shone bright. Suburbs, supermarkets, new cars, baseball on summer nights. In the other, a darker dream grew. Meetings in smoke-filled rooms, killings disguised as accidents, fortunes built on the suffering of others. The two worlds ran parallel, rarely colliding, each pretending the other didn't exist. But behind closed doors, the Mafia's leaders knew the risks. They knew that growth brought visibility, and visibility brought danger. That's why meetings became essential. Quiet summits, private gatherings, places where disputes could be settled without blood. These meetings, however, carried their own risk. Bringing too many powerful men together created a spotlight, even if unintentionally. And that spotlight was dangerous. Still, the Mafia believed in its invisibility. Decades of silence had convinced them they could not be touched. They held barbecues that were more like board meetings. They used coded language, careful gestures, signals that only insiders could understand. To the outside world, it looked like family gatherings. To those in the know, it was governance, a shadow parliament directing the flow of billions in illicit trade. By the mid-1950s, the Mafia had embedded itself so deeply into American life that extracting it would have been like trying to pull veins from a body. Trucking companies carried goods on mob-controlled routes. Movie studios negotiated with men whose smiles had knives. Politicians accepted donations with one hand and turned a blind eye with the other. The Mafia was not just surviving in post-war America. It was thriving, expanding, weaving itself into the very fabric of the nation. And yet, beneath the confidence, there was tension. Old rivalries never fully died. Men like Genovese dreamed of taking everything for themselves. Others, like Gambino, played the long game, waiting, watching. The commission kept peace, but peace was fragile. Every expansion, every new racket, every whispered betrayal pushed the balance closer to collapse. It was a paradox. The Mafia had never been stronger, yet it had never been more vulnerable. Its power was vast, but its arrogance was growing. The men at the top believed the system Luchiano had built would protect them forever. They believed the FBI's blindness would last. They believed silence would hold. But silence cracks, and arrogance invites disaster. The post-war boom created an empire, but empires attract attention. And in one small town in upstate New York, attention was about to arrive in the form of a state trooper with sharp eyes and a stubborn will. The men of the Mafia thought they were still invisible. They thought America would keep looking the other way. But the bigger you grow, the harder it is to stay hidden. And in Appalachin, for the first time in history, the hidden empire would be dragged screaming into the light. The post-war years had been their triumph. The years ahead would bring their reckoning. And the sound of that reckoning was already rumbling in the distance, like a storm gathering over the quiet hills of New York. Chapter 4: The Man Behind the Meeting. It is a cold night in New York City, late in the 1940s. A man sits in the back of a smoky Italian restaurant, his broad shoulders hunched, his heavy eyes scanning the room like a predator. He eats slowly, methodically, as if every bite is part of a ritual. Around him, men whisper, waiters glance nervously, and no one dares to interrupt. This is Vito Genovese, a man who had tasted exile, clawed his way back, and now burned with one unshakable desire: to be king. The dream of absolute power had consumed him for years, and he was ready to gamble everything to seize it. The Appalachin Meeting, the day the Mafia would finally be exposed, was born out of this man's hunger. To understand the scandal, you must first understand the man behind it. Genovese was not the kind of boss who charmed his way through life. He was not Carlo Gambino, the quiet schemer, nor Joseph Bonanno, the gentleman don. He was blunt, brutal, and impatient. His ambition was naked, his methods ruthless. Men feared him not because he was clever, but because he was relentless. He did not play chess. He broke the board in half and forced the pieces to bow. And yet, for years, he lingered in the shadows, overshadowed by men who rose faster or maneuvered smarter. For Genovese, this was intolerable. He believed the throne was his by right, and he would stop at nothing to claim it. His story begins in Italy. Born in Naples in 1902, Vito emigrated to America as a teenager, part of the wave of poor immigrants who crowded the tenements of New York. He spoke little English, but in the streets of Little Italy, fists and fear spoke louder than words. He joined gangs young, hustled for survival, and by the age of 20, had found his way into the orbit of Charles "Lucky" Luchiano. Luchiano recognized in him something raw, something dangerous. Vito was not refined, not smooth, but he was loyal and savage. He could be counted on to do the dirty work. When Luchiano staged his coup against the old bosses, eliminating Masuria and Maranzano, Genovese was there, a soldier in the storm. For his loyalty, he was rewarded. Over the years, he became one of Luciano's most trusted lieutenants. Together with Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others, they built the syndicate into a national power. But where men like Lansky thought like bankers, and men like Costello acted like diplomats, Genovese thought like a conqueror. His eyes were always on the next rung, the next prize, the next man to topple. Then came his exile. In 1937, facing a murder indictment, Genovese fled back to Italy, hoping distance would shield him. In Naples, he thrived under Mussolini's regime, ingratiating himself with the fascist elite. Some called him a collaborator, a man who traded morality for protection. But for Genovese, morality had never been part of the equation. He survived by aligning himself with power, no matter what face it wore. For nearly a decade, he operated in Europe, until the tide of war turned, and he was eventually brought back to the United States in 1945 to face trial. And then, luck, or perhaps fate, intervened. The key witness against him was murdered. With no testimony, the case collapsed. Genovese walked free. To him, this was not chance. It was destiny. He had been spared for a purpose, to rule. When he returned to New York, the world had changed. Luchiano was gone, deported. Frank Costello held sway, running the family with diplomacy and subtlety. But Costello's style was everything Genovese despised. Where Costello preferred influence over violence, Genovese preferred fear. Where Costello worked with politicians and judges, Genovese believed in the raw language of power. To him, Costello was weak, unfit to wear the crown. And so he began a plot. Every whispered conversation, every handshake deal, every quiet promise in a back room, all of it fed his growing ambition. He wanted not just his family, but the commission itself. He wanted to be recognized, publicly and privately, as the undisputed boss of bosses. But in the Luchiano system, there was no such title. The commission was meant to prevent a dictator from rising. Genovese saw that as a flaw. He intended to correct it. His first step was eliminating Costello. In 1957, he ordered a hit. One spring evening, as Costello entered his Manhattan apartment building, a gunman named Vincent, the Chin, Gigante raised a pistol and fired. The bullet grazed Costello's head, leaving him wounded but alive. But survival did not matter. Costello was shaken, humiliated. He stepped aside, retreating from the world of power. Genovese had won. He now stood at the top of the most powerful family in New York. But ruling one family was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted recognition. He wanted a gathering that would cement his place as supreme leader. And so he began to plan a meeting. Not a small dinner, not a secret handshake behind closed doors, but a grand summit, a national council of bosses. His model was a political convention, but darker, more dangerous. He would call together leaders from New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Tampa, even as far as Sicily and Havana. They would gather under one roof, and in their presence, he would take his crown. Why Apalachin? Why a quiet town in upstate New York, far from the glittering lights of the city? The answer was Joseph Barbara, a local boss and ally of the Buffalino family. Barbara owned a sprawling estate in Apalachin, with wide lawns, a large house, and privacy. To the Mafia, it seemed perfect, far from police eyes, safe in rural isolation, a place where expensive cars could roll in unnoticed. Or so they thought. But the ambition was not just symbolic. The agenda for the meeting was serious. There were disputes to settle. Over narcotics, over gambling territories, over the fallout from Albert Anastasia's assassination, which had sent shockwaves through the underworld just weeks earlier. With Costello gone and Anastasia dead, the old order was crumbling. Genovese saw himself as the man to rebuild it. He believed Apalachin would be the moment the Mafia crowned him king. Yet even as he prepared, shadows gathered. Not every boss trusted him. Some saw his ambition as dangerous. Carlo Gambino, always watching, played his own game. Joseph Bonanno, cautious and shrewd, kept his distance. The Chicago outfit, powerful in its own right, bristled at the idea of bowing to a New York dictator. But Genovese pushed forward anyway. He had waited too long, sacrificed too much, to stop now. Think of him in those days. A man in his mid-50s, stocky, his face heavy with years of violence and power. His eyes burned with hunger. He moved through rooms like a storm cloud, every man he passed feeling the weight of his ambition. He was not a man you forgot, and he did not want to be forgotten. The tragedy for Genovese is that in chasing immortality, he created disaster. By calling the meeting, he set into motion the very events that would destroy him. He believed the Mafia's invisibility would hold. He believed the rural setting would protect them. He believed the arrogance of power was safety. But arrogance is always a crack in the armor. And cracks, once struck, split wide. The Appalachin Meeting was his creation, his gamble, his coronation. But it became his undoing. The man who wanted to be boss of bosses ended up exposed, humiliated, and ultimately betrayed. In trying to step from the shadows into the light, he blinded himself to the truth. The light reveals everything. Still, in the fall of 1957, none of that had happened yet. The invitations were being sent. The cars were being prepared. The bosses were making arrangements. And in his heart, Vito Genovese believed history was about to bend to his will. He believed he was about to claim his destiny. What he could not see was that destiny has a way of twisting. That sometimes the very stage you build for your triumph becomes the gallows for your pride. Appalachin was supposed to be his crowning glory. Instead, it became the day the Mafia itself could no longer hide. And it all began with one man's hunger, one man's arrogance, one man's dream of a throne that was never meant to exist. The meeting was set. The invitations were out. The engines of Cadillacs and Lincolns were warming, ready to head toward that quiet town in upstate New York. What none of them knew was that waiting in those quiet hills was not a crown, but catastrophe. And soon, the invisible empire would learn that the man behind the meeting had led them all into the harshest light of day. Chapter 5. Appalachin, New York, an unlikely stage. The town of Appalachin did not look like the kind of place where history would change. Nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, it was a dot on the map most Americans had never heard of. A place where neighbors left their doors unlocked, where children rode bicycles down gravel roads, and where the loudest sound on a Sunday morning was the church bell echoing over the fields. Appalachin was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of town where nothing ever happened. And perhaps that was why it was chosen. To the Mafia, it seemed the perfect stage, too quiet to attract suspicion, too ordinary to be noticed. But ordinary places have a way of becoming extraordinary when ambition collides with fate. The estate belonged to Joseph Barbara, a local businessman whose outward appearance blended seamlessly into small-town life. Barbara ran a soft drink bottling plant in nearby Endicott and was known as a friendly, hard-working family man. To most of his neighbors, he was simply Joe, a man with a big house, a generous smile, and the kind of success any immigrant could be proud of. But beneath the surface, Barber was no ordinary businessman. He was a trusted figure in the Buffalino crime family, a man whose connections stretched far beyond the quiet hills of upstate New York. His estate, with its wide lawns and sprawling home, would soon become the unlikely epicenter of the Mafia's greatest exposure. From the outside, the Barber estate looked harmless. A large country house surrounded by trees. A driveway big enough for guests. Plenty of open land. It was the kind of place that might host a wedding reception, a family reunion, or a company picnic. And that was the point. To the Mafia bosses who would gather there, it offered the illusion of safety. No suspicious hotel staff. No crowded city streets. Just country air, quiet roads, and privacy. Or so they thought. The choice of Appalachin was not random. By the late 1950s, The Mafia's power had grown to a scale that demanded coordination. With Albert Anastasia freshly assassinated, with Frank Costello sidelined after the attempt on his life, and with Vito Genovese asserting his dominance, there was too much uncertainty. The bosses needed to gather to discuss territories, narcotics pipelines, gambling profits, and to settle disputes before they erupted into open warfare. They needed neutral ground, away from the prying eyes of New York City detectives or Chicago reporters. Barbara's estate seemed ideal, but small towns notice things. A stranger in Manhattan disappears into the crowd. A new car in Chicago barely earns a second glance. But in Apalachin, every unfamiliar face stands out. When luxury Cadillacs and Lincolns began to roll into the area, when men in tailored suits stepped on quiet country roads, people noticed. Neighbors may not have known who these men were, but they knew they weren't from Appalachin. Something felt off, and that unease would soon draw the attention of law enforcement. Still, before the raid, before the panic, before the headlines, Appalachin was simply a stage being prepared. Inside the house, tables were set, food was prepared, and Barbara himself grew anxious. He had suffered a heart attack earlier that year, and hosting dozens of mob bosses was no small strain. His wife and family scurried about, trying to keep up appearances, as if this were just another large gathering of friends and relatives. But there was no mistaking the gravity of the event. These were not ordinary guests. They were the rulers of America's underworld. Imagine the scene that November morning. The air crisp, the leaves fallen, the ground damp with the chill of late autumn. One by one, the cars arrived, their polished chrome gleaming in the pale sunlight. Men stepped out in dark overcoats, their breath visible in the cold air. They shook hands firmly, nodded with respect, whispered greetings in Italian or English. To the casual eye, it might have looked like a reunion of old friends. But in truth, this was a gathering of kings, each one carrying the weight of empires built on gambling, racketeering, and fear. The guest list was staggering. Bosses and capos from across the country. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy, Stefano Megadino, and representatives from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and beyond. Over 100 men of power converging on one estate in one small town. Never before had so much criminal power been concentrated in one place on American soil. It was the equivalent of the nation's darkest government meeting in secret, except this time, the secret would not hold. Inside, the air was thick with tension and ambition. At the center of it all was Vito Genovese, the architect of the meeting. He believed this was his moment to be recognized as the undisputed leader, the man to bring order after chaos. Around him, alliances were forming, disputes were simmering, and decisions were being made that would ripple across cities and industries. The men discussed narcotics, the flow of heroin from overseas. They debated gambling profits, union control, and territory boundaries. The assassination of Anastasia was fresh in their minds, and questions lingered. Who had ordered it? Who now controlled his empire? These were not casual conversations. They were matters of life and death, of millions in profit, of survival itself. But even as they spoke, the cracks in their invisibility began to widen. Outside the estate, the town of Appalachin stirred with suspicion. Neighbors saw cars lined up, more than they had ever seen at Barbara's home. A butcher delivering meat noticed the sheer quantity of food being prepared. Gas station attendants filled tank after tank of out-of-town vehicles. And then there was Edgar Croswell, the state trooper whose watchful eyes would change everything. For now, he was simply curious, but curiosity is a dangerous spark. What the mobsters did not realize was that Appalachin's very ordinariness was their downfall. They had chosen a place so quiet, so small, that their presence screamed louder than gunfire. They believed the hills shielded them. In truth, the hills amplified them. Their expensive suits, their polished cars, their heavy footsteps, all of it echoed against the silence of rural life. They might as well have painted a target on Barbara's estate. And yet, inside, they felt untouchable. The Mafia had thrived on secrecy for decades. The FBI still denied their existence. Politicians looked the other way. Reporters who got too close were silenced, bribed, or ignored. Why would Appalachin be any different? To them, this was simply business, conducted in the safety of a friendly home. The idea that their very gathering could become the spark that exposed them all never crossed their minds. But history is cruel in its ironies. The very thing Genovese hoped would crown him king, the spectacle of unity, the gathering of power, became the very thing that revealed the Mafia's existence to the world. It was a miscalculation born of arrogance, of the belief that invisibility was permanent. But invisibility is fragile, and in Appalachin, it shattered. Think of Joseph Barber that day, sweating, nervous, his heart still weak, hosting the most dangerous men in America in his home, trying to appear calm while knowing the stakes were enormous. If the meeting went smoothly, he would be remembered as the man who hosted history. If anything went wrong, his name would forever be tied to disaster. The pressure was suffocating. His wife prepared food, the kitchen filled with the smell of roasting meats, while outside, Cadillacs lined the driveway like a parade of power. For the bosses, it was business as usual. For Barbara, it was terror wrapped in hospitality. And for the town of Apalachin, it was the beginning of something no one expected. As the men settled in, as conversations deepened, as Genovese waited for his coronation, fate was already moving outside the estate. Edgar Croswell's suspicions were growing. Local eyes had seen too much, and the small town chosen for its safety was about to become the most dangerous place in America. The stage was set. The players were in place. Appalachin, New York, a quiet, unremarkable town, was about to host the day the Mafia was exposed. But the bosses inside had no idea. To them, it was just another meeting, another moment to divide spoils, settle scores, and crown a leader. They could not hear the ticking clock outside. They could not see the storm gathering. They could not imagine that within hours, their empire of silence would be broken in the most humiliating way possible. Appalachin was supposed to be invisible. Instead, it became unforgettable. And as the men raised glasses and exchanged handshakes, the world outside was preparing to rip the mask off forever. Chapter 6: The Invitation List. It begins like a secret whispered across the country, carried not by letters with return addresses, but by quiet phone calls, coded phrases, and nods exchanged in dimly lit clubs. One by one, the most powerful men in America's underworld received their summons. They were told there would be a gathering, a meeting to discuss the future, a meeting to bring order to the chaos that had erupted after Anastasia's death, Costello's retreat, and Genovese's sudden rise. A meeting to decide who truly ruled the invisible empire. The place was strange, far from the usual New York backrooms or Chicago hotels. But the promise was irresistible. All families, all bosses, together under one roof. The Mafia had always thrived on secrecy, yet here it was, daring to gather its kings like a congress of crime. The invitation list read like a roll call of shadowed royalty. Vito Genovese himself, of course, the man orchestrating it all, determined to use the gathering as his coronation. Carlo Gambino, newly strengthened after his role in the assassination of Albert Anastasia, a man with eyes like knives, quiet but calculating. Joseph Bonanno, the gentleman don, who preferred subtlety and diplomacy, yet understood the power of appearances. Joseph Prophesy, the so-called olive oil king, whose quiet demeanor belied a ruthless streak. Stefano Megadino of Buffalo, with roots stretching back to the old Sicilian world. From Detroit came representatives of the powerful partnership. From Chicago, emissaries of the outfit, who carried with them the legacy of Capone's empire. Even whispers of men from Cuba and Sicily, foreign delegates to this criminal parliament. Imagine the sheer weight of that gathering. Over 100 men, each one a node in a network that stretched across America. Gambling dens in New York, heroin shipments in Florida, labor rackets in Chicago, trucking routes in Detroit, all of it converging in one place. Each man carried not just his own reputation, but the power of the families behind him. It was as if the invisible government of America had decided to meet, not in Washington, but in a sleepy town in upstate New York. The way the invitation spread was itself a work of art. Nothing written, nothing traceable. Trusted lieutenants whispered to trusted captains. A simple phrase, "There will be a gathering." No dates, no details, until you were close enough to matter. For those inside the life, it was clear. For those outside, there was nothing but silence. Families from coast to coast began to prepare. Soldiers polished cars. Capos booked train tickets. Bosses arranged their excuses, telling wives and neighbors they had business trips, doctor's appointments, or family obligations. In truth, they were preparing to walk into one of the most infamous traps in Mafia history. Every name on that list represented a story, a dynasty, a kingdom carved out of American soil. Carlo Gambino had been patient for years, moving carefully, aligning himself with stronger allies until opportunity struck. With Anastasia gone, he was ready to step into the vacuum. Bonanno had always prided himself on being careful, scholarly even, keeping his family insulated from unnecessary wars. Yet even he knew that absence from such a meeting could be seen as defiance. Prophesy, older and more reserved, carried the weight of tradition. Megadino, the Buffalo boss, brought with him connections to Canada and Sicily, a bridge between continents. And then there were the dozens of lesser-known men, capos and underbosses, each one powerful in his region, but here only to listen, to align, to pledge loyalty. It was a who's who of organized crime, and each man understood the stakes. In their world, absence spoke louder than words. To decline the invitation was to risk isolation, suspicion, or worse. To attend was to show loyalty, to be part of the decision-making. And so they came. From New York and New Jersey, from Florida and Ohio, from Chicago and Detroit. Cars rolled northward, tires humming on highways, their trunks carrying fine suits, polished shoes, and sometimes weapons, just in case. The logistics alone were staggering. Imagine dozens of luxury cars traveling to a small rural town, their license plates revealing distant origins. Imagine the drivers, nervous, scanning the roads for police, trying to appear ordinary while carrying extraordinary passengers. In a city, such movements would vanish into the crowd. But in a place like Apalachin, every passing car was a spectacle. The butcher noticed. The gas station attendants noticed. Even the neighbors noticed. But the bosses believed in their invisibility. They believed that silence would protect them. For some, attending was not a choice, but a test of survival. If Genovese was to be recognized as the new leader, being absent could be interpreted as disloyalty. And in their world, disloyalty was fatal. For others, the meeting was opportunity. To secure more territory. To argue for a bigger share of the narcotics trade. To settle old grudges with the commission as referee. The promise of profit was too great to ignore. And then there was the allure of history. Never before had so many mob figures gathered in one place. The very act of attending was like stepping into legend. These men, so careful in their daily lives, so hidden behind fronts and facades, were about to sit together as if they were senators in a dark republic. For some, it was thrilling. For others, terrifying. But all understood the gravity. This was not a party. It was a parliament. The invitations also carried unspoken questions. Who had the right to lead? Who had the authority to dictate? Who was loyal? And who was plotting betrayal? Beneath the handshakes and smiles, beneath the cigars and glasses of wine, suspicion simmered. Every man entering Barbara's estate knew that within those walls, alliances would be forged, enemies marked, futures decided. One nod from a boss could mean fortune. One whisper could mean death. As the cars drew closer to Appalachin, as the suits were adjusted and the ties tightened, each man carried not just ambition, but fear. Fear that absence would be fatal. Fear that presence might be dangerous. Fear that the invisible empire was becoming too visible. And yet, they came, one after another, rolling into a quiet town that had never seen such power assembled. The irony is that the very size of the list doomed the meeting. Had it been smaller, quieter, perhaps history would never have noticed. But 100 men do not move invisibly, not even in the shadows. Their very presence was a beacon, a signal to anyone paying attention that something monumental was happening. And outside, in the world of Appalachin's ordinary citizens, people were paying attention. Edgar Croswell, the state trooper, would soon become the name remembered. But he was not the only one to notice. The butcher who delivered too much meat, the neighbors who saw too many cars, the gas station attendants who filled too many tanks. Each detail, small on its own, added to a picture that screamed louder than the Mafia's silence. Inside the estate, though, the men felt safe. They believed their code of silence still protected them. They believed their reputations, their power, their fearsome histories would shield them from exposure. As they shook hands and settled into discussions, they did not know that the very size of their gathering was already unraveling their secrecy. The invitation list was meant to crown Genovese. Instead, it would betray them all. Each name, each boss, each capo who stepped on a barber's lawn that November day would soon find himself in police reports, newspapers, and history books. Their invisibility would be gone. Their myth would be shattered. And it all began with that list, whispered, trusted, irresistible. In the end, the Appalachin meeting was not just a moment of arrogance. It was the culmination of years of belief in the power of silence, in the myth of invisibility. But silence cracks when too many voices gather in one place. And invisibility disappears when too many shadows converge under the same sun. The bosses thought they were assembling in secret. In truth, they were walking into history. They thought the list of names was private. In truth, it was a roll call for exposure. And as each man stepped out of his Cadillac, as each handshake was exchanged, as each whispered greeting passed between lips, the clock ticked closer to disaster. The invitation list had been sent. The men had arrived. The stage was set. And in the quiet hills of Appalachin, the Mafia was about to lose the one thing it had always relied on, its invisibility. What none of them realized was that one suspicious trooper, watching from the outside, was about to turn their parliament of shadows into the most public humiliation the Mafia had ever endured. And the list that had promised power would soon become the evidence that exposed them all. Chapter 7. Motives and Agendas. The Barber estate was no social gathering, no friendly barbecue, no innocent reunion of old acquaintances. Beneath the veneer of handshakes and smiles, beneath the scent of roasted meats and the clinking of glasses, the Appalachin meeting carried motives that were anything but ordinary. Every man who arrived that day in November 1957 carried with him an agenda. Some whispered, some shouted in private, but all deadly serious. This was not a picnic. This was Parliament. This was the Mafia deciding its future in real time. To understand the tension inside those walls, you need to picture the state of the underworld in the months leading up to Appalachin. The Mafia was at a crossroads. Power, money, and influence had never been greater. Their hands were in unions, shipping, trucking, casinos, narcotics, even politics. But great power brings great instability, and the old balance had been shattered. Albert Anastasia, the feared Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, had been gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop only weeks before the meeting. His death sent shockwaves through the underworld. Anastasia had been one of the last of the old guard, a man whose mere name made rivals tremble. His assassination left a vacuum, and vacuums in the Mafia were dangerous. Behind the scenes, it was whispered that Carlo Gambino had helped orchestrate Anastasia's fall. A patient chess moved to climb the ladder. With Anastasia gone, the Gambino family's star was rising. But who would control Anastasia's vast empire of rackets? That was one pressing question on the table. Then there was Frank Costello, once known as the Prime Minister of the underworld. Costello had ruled with diplomacy, preferring political influence over violence. But an attempt on his life in May 1957, ordered by Vito Genovese, had driven him into semi-retirement. Costello survived, but he stepped back, leaving his family vulnerable. Genovese seized control, declaring himself boss. But in the Mafia, recognition is everything. You could not simply declare yourself leader. You needed the blessing, or at least the acquiescence, of your peers. That was Genovese's real motive for Apalachin. He wanted to be crowned, to be recognized as the true head, the boss of bosses in everything but name. Narcotics were another storm cloud hanging over the gathering. For years, many bosses resisted the drug trade, fearing it was too risky, too visible, too corrosive. The code of honor, as flimsy as it often was, considered heroin and cocaine dishonorable businesses, the kind that invited too much heat. But the profits were irresistible. Genovese was one of the strongest advocates for expanding narcotics operations, seeing them as the future. He wanted control of the pipelines stretching from Europe through Cuba into American cities. Others, like Bonanno, preferred a quieter approach, wary of the scrutiny drugs would bring. This debate over narcotics wasn't just about money. It was about the very soul of the Mafia's future. And then there were the territories. The Mafia was never a monolith. It was a patchwork of families, each ruling its own domain. But borders were never clean. Disputes flared over control of unions, gambling parlors, construction projects, trucking routes, and loan sharking businesses. Detroit butted heads with Cleveland. Chicago's outfit clashed with East Coast bosses over influence in Las Vegas. Florida became a battleground with its proximity to Cuba, a lucrative hub for both gambling and drug trafficking. These disputes needed settlement, and the commission, born from Luchiano's vision, was designed for this purpose. Appalachin was meant to be the courtroom where verdicts were handed down, not with gavels, but with nods and whispers. Another unspoken motive was international expansion. Havana had become a jewel of Mafia ambition. Casinos flourished there, shielded by corrupt politicians and embraced by tourists. Meyer Lansky had built Havana into a paradise for gambling, a place where the money flowed freer than water. But Fidel Castro's revolution simmered in the background, threatening to destabilize the entire operation. The bosses needed to coordinate their strategy. Would they double down on Havana or prepare for the storm brewing in Cuba? Apalachin was the place to decide. And let's not forget the looming question of law enforcement. The Kefauver hearings in the early 50s had put organized crime on the national stage, with millions of Americans watching mobsters squirm on live television, refusing to answer questions. The Mafia had survived that spectacle, but the pressure hadn't gone away. While Edgar Hoover still denied the existence of a national syndicate, state and local law enforcement had grown more aggressive. The Appalachin bosses needed to discuss strategy. How would they maintain their invisibility? How would they adapt to a country slowly waking up to their presence? Each man carried personal motives as well. Carlo Gambino saw the meeting as an opportunity to solidify his quiet rise, to move from the shadows into undeniable prominence. Joseph Bonanno hoped to keep his family insulated, to avoid wars that could threaten his long-term survival. Joseph Megadino wanted to ensure Buffalo's influence remained secure, especially as it controlled routes into Canada. Prophesy wanted to protect his old-world operations, rooted in family and tradition, from being overshadowed by the brash ambition of men like Genovese. For every boss, the meeting was a chance to push his agenda forward, to gain allies, to test loyalties. The air inside Barbara's estate that day was thick not only with cigar smoke, but with calculation. Picture it. Men sitting in heavy chairs, their suits sharp, their faces unreadable, their words careful. Every statement was weighed, every silence deliberate. It was less a meeting and more a chess match, with dozens of games happening simultaneously. Some conversations happened at the table, formal and direct. Others took place in quiet corners, whispered between allies, promises exchanged under the hum of polite chatter. But beneath all of it pulsed one undeniable truth. Genovese wanted recognition. His ambition was the engine driving Appalachin. He had toppled Costello. He had maneuvered himself into power. Now he wanted the blessing of the commission, the final stamp that would cement his reign. Without it, his rule was fragile, open to challenge. With it, he would stand at the peak of the underworld. Every other motive, narcotics, territories, Havana, unions, was real, important, pressing. But they were the backdrop. The true drama was whether Genovese would succeed in crowning himself king. And not everyone wanted to see that happen. Gambino, careful and cunning, preferred to let others make mistakes while he waited. He had no interest in a flamboyant coronation. Bonanno, cautious as ever, distrusted Genovese's hunger. Even in Chicago, the outfit had little desire to submit to a New York dictator. They valued their independence, their empire too vast to bend the knee. These tensions simmered quietly as the men exchanged pleasantries, their smiles masking suspicion. It is easy to look back now and see the arrogance of it all. Over 100 mobsters gathering in one place, believing they could remain unseen. But at the time, they believed they were untouchable. Decades of silence, decades of invisibility, decades of operating in the shadows had convinced them they could do anything. The meeting at Apalachin was proof of that arrogance. Believing they could gather openly, discuss openly, decide openly, and then melt back into the shadows without consequence. Yet while the bosses argued, whispered, and schemed, fate moved quietly outside. Edgar Croswell, the state trooper whose suspicion was growing, patrolled the roads, noticing the expensive cars, the unfamiliar faces, the luxury that didn't fit in a small rural town. For the men inside, the motives were clear, the agendas pressing. But for Croswell, what he saw was simpler. Something was happening here that didn't belong. And that simple suspicion would prove more powerful than any motive the Mafia carried into Barbara's estate. The irony is brutal. The bosses gathered to secure their empire, to crown a leader, to settle disputes. But in doing so, they exposed themselves. The very act of trying to strengthen their invisibility made them visible. The very meeting meant to protect them doomed them. As the hours passed, as cigars burned down to ash and glasses were drained, the men inside believed they were shaping the future. They believed their empire would endure, their silence would hold, their power would remain unchallenged. But outside, the law was watching, preparing. The motives and agendas that filled that room would soon be irrelevant, drowned out by the chaos of men in suits, sprinting across muddy fields, tripping over fences, abandoning cars in their desperation to escape. In the end, the Appalachin meeting was about ambition. It was about Vito Genovese's hunger, about the Mafia's drive to grow, about the desire to control everything from Harlem dice games to Havana casinos. But history is cruel. Ambition often plants the seeds of downfall. And in Appalachin, the seeds were planted the moment the first invitation was whispered, the moment the first Cadillac rolled into town. Inside, motives clashed, agendas collided, power was debated. Outside, destiny waited, patient, inevitable. The Mafia thought it was writing the script of its triumph. In truth, it was walking into the opening act of its humiliation. And as the meeting carried on, as plans were made and alliances tested, the world outside edged closer. The clock was ticking, and soon, the doors of secrecy would be ripped wide open. The motives that brought them together would be overshadowed by the headlines that tore them apart. The invisible empire was about to be dragged into the light, and no amount of planning could stop it. The agendas of men like Genovese, Gambino, and Bonanno would vanish into the roar of exposure. All because they believed that silence would last forever. All because they believed the shadows could never be broken. But shadows, no matter how deep, cannot survive the daylight. And in Appalachin, the daylight was already at the door. Chapter 8, November 14th, 1957. The gathering begins. The morning broke cold over upstate New York, the kind of biting November air that seeps into your bones and makes even the strongest men pull their coats tighter. Appalachin was silent, the mist curling low over the rolling hills, barns sitting still against the gray sky. To the locals, it was just another ordinary day in a town where nothing much ever happened. But this November morning would not be ordinary. By nightfall, the name of this town would be burned into history as the place where America's most invisible empire stumbled into the light. At the heart of it all was Joseph Barber's estate. His house, sprawling and comfortable, sat on acres of quiet land, the driveway stretching like an open invitation. Inside, preparations were already underway. Tables were set, the kitchen filled with the aroma of meats roasting, cheeses laid out, wine uncorked. To any outsider, it might have looked like preparations for a wedding banquet, or perhaps a large family reunion. But to those who knew, it was something much darker. Barber was not hosting family. He was hosting kings of the underworld. The first cars began arriving mid-morning, rolling quietly along country roads not built for such luxury. Their polished chrome gleamed against the dull sky. These were not the battered trucks of farmers or the modest sedans of working men. These were Cadillacs, Lincolns, Buicks, sleek machines with out-of-state plates. They turned heads as they passed gas stations and shops, their presence as unnatural in Appalachin as a parade of lions through a sheep pasture. The locals noticed, though most said nothing. But one man would not just notice, he would act. That man, Trooper Edgar Croswell, had been watching for weeks. For now, though, inside Barber's house, the atmosphere was one of power and ceremony. Men stepped from their cars, coats buttoned, hats tilted low, shoes crunching against gravel. They shook hands in the driveway, some offering smiles, others just curt nods. To see them together was to see the embodiment of an invisible government. Each one represented a family, an empire. Carlo Gambino, quiet but sharp-eyed, with his calm, fox-like demeanor. Joseph Bonanno, the gentleman Don, his manners polished, his mind always cautious. Joseph Prophesy, the olive oil king, hiding ruthless control beneath a kindly surface. Stefano Megadino of Buffalo, old school, his presence reminding everyone of the Sicilian roots that still bound them all. And at the center, of course, was Vito Genovese. Stocky, thick-necked, his gaze heavy with the hunger that had driven him here. For Genovese, this was not just a meeting. This was Coronation Day. He had toppled Costello, survived exile, and now stood poised to claim what he believed was his rightful throne. The sight of so many bosses gathered in one place was meant to seal his power. If he walked away from Appalachin with their recognition, his rule would be untouchable. One by one, more cars arrived. From New Jersey, from Chicago, from Detroit, from Cleveland, from as far as Florida. Each arrival swelled the weight of the gathering. Over 100 men of power converged on this small town. To the Mafia, it was a show of unity. To history, it was a fatal mistake. Inside, the men settled into discussions. The dining room filled with a low murmur of Italian and English, voices overlapping, cigars glowing in the haze. Waiters carried plates heavy with food. Wine glasses clinked. But behind the small talk was business, the real reason they had come. Who would take Anastasia's territories? How would profits from Havana's casinos be divided? Should narcotics pipelines be expanded? And if so, who controlled them? These were not idle conversations. They were negotiations worth millions, worth lives. Each man measured his words, careful not to reveal too much, careful not to offend the wrong boss. For Joseph Barbara, the host, the day was a strain. Still weak from his heart attack earlier that year, he moved stiffly, sweating through his shirt despite the chill outside. Hosting so many powerful men was an honor, yes, but also a risk. If anything went wrong, if word leaked, if law enforcement came too close, his name, his house, his family would be forever tied to disaster. As he moved between rooms, forcing smiles, offering greetings, one could imagine the dread gnawing at him beneath the surface. Outside, though, fate was already moving. Trooper Croswell had seen the cars. He knew Barber's reputation, whispers of connections, rumors of shady dealings. Seeing so many expensive vehicles pull into the estate set off alarms in his mind. He began making calls, gathering other troopers, planning to investigate. The bosses inside had no idea. They believed they were safe. They believed the hills of Appalachin shielded them. But the very silence of the town betrayed them. In a city, their presence would have vanished into the noise. Here it screamed. Back inside, the conversations deepened. Some men leaned close, whispering promises and threats. Others spoke more loudly, laying out disputes, demanding resolutions. It was business, but it was also theater. Each man wanted to project strength, to prove his importance. And yet, beneath it all, there was unease. Too many bosses in one place. Too many cars outside. Too much noise in a world that thrived on silence. Some must have felt it, that edge of danger, though they pushed it aside. They had come too far to back down now. Genovese sat at the center, listening, nodding, pressing his case. He argued for expansion into narcotics, for unity under his leadership, for order in the wake of Anastasia's death. Some agreed, some did not, but none could ignore him. His presence was heavy, undeniable. This was his stage, his moment, and he played his part with the confidence of a man who believed destiny was on his side. Meanwhile, more cars kept arriving. More suits stepped out. More conversations sparked. The estate swelled with power until it seemed impossible that such a gathering could remain secret. The arrogance of it all hung in the air like perfume, thick, intoxicating, dangerous. And then came the first ripple of trouble. Word spread quietly that state troopers had been seen nearby, watching, noting license plates. Some laughed it off. After all, what could a few troopers do against the might of the Mafia? Others grew nervous. The illusion of invisibility had been their shield for decades. But here, in this small town, the shield was cracking. Still, the meeting went on. Men lit cigars, poured more wine, continued their business as if nothing could touch them. They believed in their code, their silence, their fearsome reputations. They believed they could outlast anything. But outside, Edgar Croswell's suspicions were hardening into certainty. He called for roadblocks to be set up. He ordered troopers to keep watch. Slowly, quietly, the noose began to tighten around the estate. Inside, no one knew yet. The bosses were still deep in their discussions, still plotting their futures, still congratulating themselves on their power. But history was shifting beneath their feet. The gathering that was meant to strengthen them was already unraveling the myth of their invisibility. Picture the scene. A long dining room filled with smoke and whispers. Men of immense power leaning over plates of food. Glasses raised in toast to loyalty and brotherhood. Outside, in the cold November air, state troopers huddled by their cars, radios crackling, eyes sharp. Two worlds colliding, though neither yet fully aware of the other. The gathering had begun. The clock was ticking, and within hours, the Mafia's greatest secret would be laid bare. For now, though, the bosses still believed they were safe, still believed their shadows could protect them, still believed Appalachin was theirs to command. But the silence of the town had already betrayed them, and the daylight was coming. November 14th, 1957, the day the Mafia gathered, believing in their power. The day their arrogance became their undoing. The gathering had begun, and so too had the unraveling. Chapter 9. The Watchful Trooper. The morning of November 14th in Appalachin was cold, clear, and ordinary. Farmers fed their animals. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, and the town hummed along in the slow rhythm of rural America. Nothing about that day suggested it would become one of the most consequential in the history of organized crime. Nothing, that is, except the sharp eyes of one man, a state trooper named Edgar D. Croswell. He was not a federal agent, not a celebrated detective, not even a man chasing glory. He was a small-town lawman doing his job. But sometimes history turns because someone refuses to look away. Croswell had been stationed in the Appalachian area for years. He knew the roads, the faces, the rhythms of local life. And he also knew Joseph Barbara. To the townsfolk, Barbara was a respectable businessman, the proud owner of a soft drink bottling plant, a family man with a big house on McFall Road. But Croswell had heard the whispers. He had seen Barbara's wealth grow faster than most men's and had long suspected there was more behind that fortune than soda pop. When Barbara suffered a heart attack earlier that year, Croswell filed it away in his mind. Men like Barbara, he thought, didn't climb ladders that high on soft drinks alone. So when Croswell noticed a string of expensive cars with out-of-state plates cruising into Apalachin that November morning, something stirred in him. This wasn't normal. Appalachin didn't draw Cadillacs and Lincolns. It didn't draw well-dressed men in dark overcoats, carrying themselves with the air of power. The town was quiet farmland, a place where the loudest noise was the crack of a tractor engine or the barking of a dog. These cars didn't belong. He watched. He wrote down plate numbers. Some from New Jersey, others from New York City, still others from Chicago. Croswell's suspicion sharpened with every detail. He stopped at the local gas station and asked attendants about the traffic. They told him they'd filled tank after tank for men in sharp suits. Men who didn't speak much but carried themselves like they owned the world. The butcher in town had delivered a suspiciously large order of meat to Barbara's estate. Croswell added it up in his head. Too many cars. Too much food. Too many strangers. Something was happening on that hill. At first, his colleagues were skeptical. Organized crime? In Appalachin? The Mafia was still a whisper to many in law enforcement, a rumor too big to believe. But Croswell trusted his gut. He called for backup, rallying other state troopers to keep watch on the road surrounding the Barbara estate. They set up makeshift observation posts, noting each car that rolled up the driveway, counting each well-dressed stranger who stepped inside. And with each arrival, the scale of what was happening became undeniable. Croswell had no idea that he was witnessing history, that the men entering Barbara's house represented the highest council of organized crime in America. To him, it was a suspicious gathering of criminals, one too large to ignore. But in fact, he was staring at the invisible government of the Mafia itself. Gambino, Bonanno, Medino, prophesied Genovese. Men who, up until that moment, had lived in shadows, their names known only in whispers, were now gathered under one roof within his jurisdiction. The irony is sharp. While Edgar Hoover in Washington continued to deny the existence of a national crime syndicate, a lone state trooper in rural New York was piecing it together with nothing more than curiosity and common sense. Croswell wasn't working with wiretaps or deep cover informants. He wasn't reading classified files. He was watching cars. He was asking questions. He was refusing to dismiss what was right in front of him. As the hours passed, Croswell's certainty hardened. He contacted his superiors, urging them to act. Roadblocks were ordered on routes leading out of Appalachin. Troopers began positioning themselves, preparing to intercept whatever was unfolding. Inside Barbara's house, the bosses continued their business, oblivious to the tightening net outside. The arrogance of their invisibility blinded them. They believed that in a small town, they were safe. They could not imagine that a trooper with a sharp eye was about to rip the veil away. But Croswell was not motivated by ambition. He wasn't looking to make headlines. He was doing what good cops do, following instincts, refusing to look the other way. That morning, he could have shrugged off the strange traffic. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem. But something inside him insisted it mattered. Something told him that ordinary people in his town deserved to be protected, even from enemies they didn't know they had. Imagine him standing by the roadside, notebook in hand, breath clouding in the cold air, watching another Cadillac glide past. Inside the car, men worth millions whispered to each other, smug in their secrecy. And on the roadside stood Croswell, quiet, steady, taking note. A man of no criminal empire, no political machine, no underworld network. Just a uniform, a badge, and persistence. By midday, Croswell had counted enough cars to know this was no small gathering. His colleagues, once doubtful, began to see it too. Something enormous was unfolding at Barbara's estate. And soon, the decision was made. They would move in. But before the raid, before the chaos, before the mad scramble of bosses in $1,000 suits tearing across muddy fields, there was this moment. The watchful trooper, the ordinary man who saw what others ignored. Without Croswell, the Appalachin Meeting might have passed unnoticed, its decisions shaping the underworld for years to come. Genovese might have been crowned, the narcotics empire might have expanded unchecked, and the Mafia's invisibility might have endured. Instead, one man's suspicion cracked the myth wide open. One man's refusal to dismiss the obvious pulled the curtain back on the Mafia's secret world. Croswell did not know it yet, but he was about to change history. Back inside Barbara's estate, the cigars burned lower, the wine flowed, and the conversations deepened. The bosses believed they were safe, believed the town was theirs for the day. But outside, Croswell and his troopers waited, patient, watchful, preparing to strike. And when they did, the underworld would never be the same. The watchful trooper had seen too much, and in Appalachin, the shadows could no longer hide. Chapter 10. The Raid on Barbara's Estate. The quiet November air in Appalachin was broken by the low hum of police radios and the crunch of boots against frosted grass. State troopers moved into position on the roads around Joseph Barbara's estate, their cars angled to block the exits. It was not the FBI swooping in with an orchestrated sting. It was not a federal task force with reams of intelligence. It was a handful of local officers, led by Trooper Edgar Croswell, acting on instinct, suspicion, and a refusal to ignore what seemed impossible. They were about to walk straight into history, an unplanned raid that would shatter the Mafia's cloak of invisibility. Inside the Barbara home, the atmosphere was far different. The dining room was alive with chatter, the smoke from cigars drifting lazily toward the ceiling. Bottles of wine clinked, plates heavy with food were passed across the table. To the men assembled, over 100 bosses, underbosses, and capos, it was business cloaked in the comfort of brotherhood. They spoke in low tones, settled disputes, whispered alliances. On the surface, it was calm, confident, almost celebratory. None of them imagined that outside, the walls were closing in. Croswell and his fellow troopers were nervous. They were outnumbered, not in men, but in power. They knew that the people inside Barbara's estate were not ordinary criminals. They were bosses of entire cities, men whose reach extended into unions, construction, politics, even law enforcement itself. If they had guessed wrong, if this was merely a gathering of businessmen, their careers would be over. But Croswell's instincts told him otherwise. Every polished Cadillac parked along that driveway was a red flag. Every unfamiliar face in town confirmed it. And now, with roadblocks in place, there was no turning back. The decision to move was not made lightly. Croswell and his men had no blueprint for what they were about to do. They carried no warrants, no detailed dossiers. What they carried was suspicion and the authority of the badge. In that moment, it was enough. They moved closer, their presence subtle at first, just patrol cars idling, officers jotting down license plates. But then, like a ripple spreading across water, word reached inside that the police were outside. The effect was immediate. The calm, collected meeting dissolved into chaos. Glasses were set down, cigars stubbed out. Men glanced at one another, eyes wide, calculating. Invisibility had been their shield for decades, but now, in an instant, it was gone. The realization hit like a gunshot. They were surrounded. They could not stay. They had to scatter. The sight that followed was surreal. Men who had built empires on fear, men whose names carried weight in every back room and alley, bolted from the house like startled deer. Expensive suits and polished shoes tore across muddy fields. Hats flew off heads. Bosses tripped over fences, crashed through hedges, dove into ditches. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy, men of immense power, were suddenly reduced to fugitives scrambling across farmland, their dignity left behind on Barbara's manicured lawn. Some tried to slip out quietly in their cars, only to find the roads blocked. Engines revved, tires spun, but the troopers were ready. License plates were taken down, names noted, faces recognized. Others sprinted into the woods, their fine shoes sinking into mud, their coats snagging on branches. Neighbors would later recall the bizarre sight of well-dressed men, breathless and panicked, darting through yards and fields like thieves in the night. Barber himself was stricken, suffering from ill health. He panicked at the sight of police swarming near his home. He retreated upstairs, collapsing in a bed, feigning illness, hoping to avoid suspicion. But his house had already betrayed him. His name, his estate, would forever be tied to the disaster unfolding on his front lawn. The troopers, astonished by what they were witnessing, scrambled to contain the chaos. They set up checkpoints, stopped fleeing cars, and detained men who could not explain their presence. At first, the mobsters tried excuses. They were there for a barbecue, they said. They were visiting their sick friend Joe. They were just passing through. But the excuses fell flat. Too many expensive cars. Too many high-profile men. Too much evidence piled up in plain sight. In the panic, dozens of mobsters were caught. Some were pulled from cars, questioned, identified. Others were literally dragged from the woods, their fine suits torn and muddy, their polished shoes ruined. Nearly 60 men were detained and interrogated. For law enforcement, it was a treasure trove. Names that had once been whispered in rumors were now written in police reports. Faces once invisible were now photographed, documented, exposed. The image of powerful mafia bosses scrambling through fields became legendary. For decades, the mob had cultivated an aura of control, of power, of fear. They were ghosts in the public imagination, seen only in stories, untouchable in reality. But here they were, humiliated, running like ordinary criminals, reduced to prey before the eyes of local police. The myth cracked that day, and once cracked, it could never be fully repaired. For Genovese, the architect of the meeting, the raid was a disaster. What was meant to be his coronation became his humiliation. Instead of walking away crowned with legitimacy, he found himself exposed, his ambition mocked by headlines across the country. The very gathering meant to cement his power had invited law enforcement into the heart of the Mafia's secret world. The raid itself was not violent. No shots were fired, no blood spilled. But its impact was seismic. It was not just the arrests, but the proof. For the first time, law enforcement had undeniable evidence of a national crime syndicate. For the first time, the Mafia could not claim to be a myth, a figment of imagination, a Hollywood invention. The Appalachin raid ripped the mask away. Back in Washington, Edgar Hoover could no longer deny what had been exposed. The photographs, the reports, the sheer scale of the gathering made it impossible. The FBI, embarrassed by its years of denial, was forced to shift. From that day forward, organized crime became a federal priority. Task forces were formed. Investigations deepened. The days of invisibility were over. But on the ground in Apalachin, it didn't feel like a grand victory. It felt chaotic, improvised, almost absurd. Troopers laughed in disbelief as they recounted the sight of mobsters crashing through bushes, stumbling over fences, their reputations undone in an instant. Local reporters rushed to cover the spectacle. Their stories soon carried across the nation. Ordinary Americans, reading the headlines, realized for the first time that the Mafia wasn't just a story. It was real, it was organized, and it was here. The raid on Barber's estate was, in some ways, an accident. A gathering too large, a town too small, a trooper too observant. But history often turns on such accidents. In one afternoon, the Mafia's greatest strength, its invisibility, was torn away by a handful of local officers acting on instinct. The bosses would recover. Yes, they would regroup, adjust, continue their operations. But they would never again be truly invisible. The myth was gone, replaced by the hard glare of exposure. Imagine the final moments of that day. The driveway littered with abandoned cars, mud-stained suits hanging awkwardly on men being led away by troopers, the Barbara estate heavy with silence. Inside, the tables still groaned with untouched food, the wine bottles half empty, the cigars burned down to ash. What had begun as a coronation ended as a rout. What had begun as a triumph ended as a humiliation. For Edgar Croswell, it was vindication. His suspicion had uncovered something larger than he ever imagined. He had not just interrupted a meeting. He had ripped open the veil on the most powerful criminal organization in America. For the Mafia, it was a wound that would never fully heal. The raid on Barbara's estate was not the end of their power, but it was the end of their myth. And in the world of organized crime, myth was often more powerful than muscle. Without it, they were just men, fallible, vulnerable, visible. November 14th, 1957. A date etched into history not with bullets, but with panic. Not with blood, but with exposure. The raid on Barbara's estate was the moment the Mafia's shadow empire was dragged, kicking and scrambling, into the light. And yet, this was only the beginning. The arrests, the interrogations, the media storm, these were the aftershocks. The true impact of Apalachin would ripple for decades, reshaping the underworld, rewriting the FBI's mission, and forever changing how America saw the Mafia. But for the men in suits that afternoon, running breathless through muddy fields, tripping over fences, dignity lost in a haze of panic, it was a moment they would never forget. The day they believed they were untouchable, until the shadows betrayed them. Chapter 11. The Great Mafia Getaway. The moment the first whispers of police outside the Barbara estate reached the dining room, the entire atmosphere shifted. The confidence, the arrogance, the calm certainty that had carried these men into Appalachin evaporated in an instant. Cigar smoke still lingered in the air. Wine still sat in glasses. But the men who had minutes earlier been discussing empires and profits now stared at each other with narrowed eyes and clenched jaws. The spell was broken. The shield of invisibility that had protected them for decades had been pierced, and survival instincts took over. It began with chairs scraping back across the polished floor, the sound abrupt and frantic. Men rose from the table, some stumbling in their haste, others moving with cold, sudden precision. Their conversations ended mid-sentence. Plates of food were abandoned. Hats were snatched from hooks. In a matter of seconds, the gathering dissolved into chaos. For all their power, for all their wealth, for all their influence, these men were still human, and nothing reveals humanity faster than fear. Imagine the scene as it unfolded. 100 of the most powerful figures in organized crime, men who commanded armies of soldiers, men whose names were whispered in fear from New York to Chicago, suddenly scrambling like prey. Expensive suits tore at the seams. Shiny leather shoes slipped in the mud. Hats tumbled into ditches. Some ran for their cars, fumbling with keys, slamming doors shut, engines roaring as tires spun in panic. Others, realizing the roads were blocked, bolted into the fields and woods surrounding Barbara's estate, their polished shoes sinking into the cold November earth. Carlo Gambino, the man who would one day be considered the most powerful boss in America, was spotted darting across a muddy yard, his tailor trousers splattered with dirt. Joseph Bonanno, usually the picture of calm calculation, was seen stumbling near a fence, his face tight with panic. Joseph Prophesy, the olive oil king, ran through hedges like a common fugitive. Even the elder statesmen, men who prided themselves on composure, lost their dignity as they scrambled to escape the tightening net of state troopers. It was, in every sense, a great getaway, but it was not graceful. There were no carefully planned exits, no secret tunnels, no clever disguises. There was only raw panic. For decades, the Mafia had built its myth on control, on power, on the idea that its leaders were untouchable. But in Appalachin, the mask cracked, and in its place was a farcical scene. Men of immense reputation reduced to running through the mud like schoolboys fleeing a principal. The local residents could hardly believe their eyes. Farmers tending their fields saw well-dressed men sprinting across pastures, their coats flapping, their shoes sinking. Housewives peered through curtains to see strangers tearing through yards, vaulting fences, crashing into bushes. Dogs barked at men who had once ruled neighborhoods with iron fists. For the people of Apalachin, it was surreal, like watching characters from newspaper headlines suddenly drop into their quiet, ordinary lives. The troopers themselves were astonished. Edgar Croswell and his men had expected trouble. They had expected resistance, perhaps even violence. What they hadn't expected was this display of chaos. As cars attempted to roar down blocked roads, troopers flagged them down, demanding explanations. The excuses came quickly, absurdly. "We're here for a barbecue," one said. Another insisted he was visiting his sick friend, Joseph Barbara. Yet another claimed he had gotten lost on the road. But the sheer volume of men, the sheer number of luxury cars, made the lies laughable. No one believed them. Troopers pulled men from cars, noted their names, jotted down license plates. They recognized some faces from wanted posters, others from police files. But many names were new. Men who had until that day been invisible to law enforcement, ghosts who now had shape and form. Photographs were taken, notes scribbled, arrests made. In a matter of hours, the Mafia's carefully maintained secrecy unraveled. And still, the Great Escape continued. Some mobsters, abandoning all pretense, tore into the woods, desperate to outrun the troopers. They crashed through branches, stumbled over rocks, slipped into ditches. Their suits, once immaculate, became torn and filthy. Their hands bled from scratches. They were hunted men, not kings. Some managed to slip away, melting into the countryside, catching rides out of town, vanishing before the troopers could catch them. But many were not so lucky. One of the more bizarre images of the day was of powerful bosses crouching in hedges, their breath visible in the cold air, waiting silently as troopers passed nearby. These men, who had once commanded fear with a mere glance, now hid like frightened children. One was discovered lying flat in a ditch, his hat pulled low over his face, as if that could disguise his identity. Another was dragged from under a porch, his expensive suit caked with mud. The dignity of the Mafia dissolved with every capture. For Joseph Barbara, the host, the panic was even worse. His health was fragile, his body still weakened from his heart attack. As the raid unfolded, he collapsed into bed, feigning illness, hoping that if troopers entered his home, they would see only a sick man, not the host of history's most infamous underworld gathering. But the lie could not hold. His estate, filled with luxury cars and fleeing mobsters, had already condemned him. His name would forever be tied to the disaster. The image of powerful men reduced to chaos struck the press like lightning. Reporters relished the story, painting vivid pictures of mob bosses scattering through woods, running in panic, abandoning cars worth thousands of dollars. The Great Getaway became a symbol, not just of the raid, but of the Mafia's vulnerability. For decades, they have been ghosts. But ghosts don't leave footprints in the mud. Ghosts don't get photographed while fleeing through fields. That day, the Mafia lost its invisibility. For Genovese, the orchestrator of the meeting, the humiliation was complete. He had intended to use Appalachin as his coronation. He wanted the bosses to recognize him as the supreme leader, the man who had toppled Costello and inherited Luchiano's dream. Instead, he watched as the meeting collapsed in a farce, as his peers fled like rats from a sinking ship. Instead of being crowned, he was exposed. Instead of triumph, he was mocked. The Great Getaway was not just a physical escape. It was a metaphor for the Mafia's myth unraveling. In those frantic moments, the world glimpsed the truth. These men, for all their power, were not untouchable. They could run. They could hide. They could be caught. And once that illusion was broken, it could never be fully repaired. Law enforcement took full advantage. Nearly 60 men were detained and questioned. Some were charged, though many charges would not stick. But the true victory was the evidence itself. The police had names, faces, license plates. They had photographs of the nation's most powerful mobsters gathered in one place. It was undeniable proof that a national syndicate existed. For Hoover and the FBI, who had long denied such a thing, it was an embarrassment. For prosecutors, it was ammunition. For the public, it was revelation. Back in Apalachin, the fields bore the scars of the chaos. Fences broken, grass trampled, muddy footprints leading in every direction. Abandoned hats and cigarette butts littered the ground. The Barbara estate, once a symbol of quiet prosperity, became infamous overnight. Its name would forever be linked to the day the Mafia was exposed. But for the men who ran, the humiliation lingered. Carlo Gambino, who would later become the most powerful Don in America, carried with him the memory of sprinting through fields to escape local police. Joseph Bonanno, who prided himself on calm strategy, had been reduced to a fugitive in the mud. Genovese himself, so hungry for recognition, was mocked for orchestrating the disaster. The Great Getaway haunted them all, and yet, in their humiliation, they adapted. The Mafia would never again allow such a gathering. Never again would so many bosses sit under one roof, exposed to the risk of discovery. From Appalachin onward, their meetings would be smaller, quieter, more cautious. The arrogance that had brought them to Barbara's lawn was gone. In its place was a wary respect for the dangers of exposure. The Great Getaway was not just an escape. It was a turning point. It showed law enforcement that the Mafia could be found, confronted, and humiliated. It showed the public that the Mafia was real, not a myth. And it showed the bosses themselves that even kings can be reduced to prey. Picture the final moments of that day. Men being herded into police cars, their faces grim, their suits muddy. Troopers jotting down notes, their breath visible in the cold air. Reporters snapping photographs, capturing the moment forever. And scattered across the countryside, footprints fading in the mud, silent reminders of the day the Mafia ran. November 14th, 1957. The day of the Great Getaway. The day the Mafia's myth cracked wide open. The day the invisible empire was dragged into the light, not by bullets or betrayals, but by panic, by humiliation, by the sound of powerful men running for their lives. And though the bosses would rebuild, though the Mafia would endure, they would never again be truly invisible. The world had seen them run, and once seen, the image could never be erased. Chapter 12. Caught in the Net. The fields around Joseph Barbara's estate in Appalachin still bore the marks of chaos. Muddy footprints trailed across pastures, broken fences leaned at odd angles, and tire ruts carved deep scars into the earth where expensive cars had spun and failed to escape. By the time the sun began its slow descent on that cold November day, the Great Getaway was over. Some mobsters had managed to flee into the countryside and slip away. But many others, slowed by panic, betrayed by their own arrogance, or trapped by roadblocks, were caught in the net cast by a handful of New York State troopers. What began as suspicion in the mind of Edgar Croswell had become one of the most astonishing roundups in American crime history. By the end of the day, nearly 60 men were detained, questioned, and identified. For decades, these figures had lived as phantoms, their names known only in whispers, their existence denied even by the nation's top law enforcement officials. But now, they were being recorded in police logs, their faces captured in photographs, their aliases peeled away. The myth of invisibility was gone, and in its place was hard evidence. The Mafia was real, it was national, and it had just been caught red-handed. The arrests themselves carried an air of surreal comedy, mixed with humiliation. Troopers stopped car after car as they attempted to leave the estate. Behind the wheels sat men in fine suits, their hats pulled low, their excuses ready. One insisted he was simply in town for a barbecue. Another claimed he had come to visit his sick friend, Joseph Barbara. Others said they had gotten lost, or that they had no idea what was happening inside the house. But when the troopers looked past the words, they saw the truth in the details. Cars filled with men in tailored clothes, expensive watches on their wrists, money bulging in their pockets. No one believed their stories, and the lies only deepened the embarrassment. Some were caught in more dramatic fashion. A few bosses, too afraid to face the roadblocks, had bolted into the woods. Troopers found them hours later, stumbling and breathless, their polished shoes caked with mud, their suits ripped by branches. These men, who had built empires on fear, now looked like frightened fugitives, dragged back to the estate in disgrace. The sight of them being marched by local police through fields where cows grazed would have been laughable if it weren't so momentous. For years, law enforcement had struggled to penetrate the Mafia's world. And here, in the space of a few hours, dozens of its leaders have been exposed not by wiretaps or infiltrations, but by their own reckless arrogance. The questioning began almost immediately. At local police stations, troopers sat across from men who rarely spoke their own names aloud. They asked simple questions. Who are you? Why are you here? Where are you going? The answers came in flat tones, evasive and absurd. I was visiting a sick friend. I was here on business. I was passing through. But every time another man gave the same excuse, the pattern became more obvious. This was no coincidence. This was no barbecue. This was a meeting. And for law enforcement, that word, meeting, was gold. For decades, skeptics had dismissed the idea of a national crime syndicate. The Mafia, they argued, was fragmented, local, chaotic. But here, in Appalachin, the evidence was undeniable. Over 100 mobsters from across the country had converged on a single house in rural New York. The names alone were staggering. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy, Stefano Megadino, Vito Genovese. Men who were supposed to be invisible were suddenly very visible, and their presence together proved what many had long suspected. The photographs taken that day became iconic. Grainy black and white images of men in suits, standing by police cars, their expressions caught between defiance and shame. Some looked furious, their eyes narrowed, their jaws clenched, as if daring the cameras to record them. Others looked weary, their shoulders slumped, as though the weight of exposure had already sunk in. These were not the glamorous images Hollywood would later produce of mobsters sipping whiskey in dimly lit clubs. These were snapshots of powerful men stripped bare by circumstance, caught in a net they could not escape. For the state troopers, it was overwhelming. They were not equipped to interrogate the most powerful mobsters in America. Many of the names meant little to them in the moment, but they recorded everything: license plates, aliases, statements, scraps of information. Those scraps, when pieced together, became a mosaic that revealed the scope of the Mafia like never before. The irony was thick. The FBI, with its vast resources, had denied the Mafia's existence for years. And yet here, in a small rural town, a handful of state troopers had produced the most concrete evidence of organized crime's national reach. The mobsters, of course, tried to minimize the damage. They denied everything, stuck to their flimsy cover stories, and relied on their lawyers to clean up the mess. Many of those detained were released without charges. Some cases fizzled in court. The Mafia had always known how to manipulate the legal system, and Appalachin was no exception. But in the court of public opinion, the damage was done. The Mafia had been seen, photographed, recorded. No amount of denial could erase the images of bosses fleeing through muddy fields or sitting grimly in police custody. For the families of Appalachin, the day was unforgettable. Neighbors told stories of watching men in expensive suits run past their houses, of finding discarded hats and shoes in their fields. Some laughed about it for years, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. Others, realizing only later who those men had been, spoke with awe and disbelief. The idea that their quiet town had hosted the secret rulers of America seemed almost impossible. And yet it had happened, right before their eyes. The humiliation for the Mafia was profound. These were men who prided themselves on dignity, on respect, on image of strength. To be seen running, to be photographed hiding, to be dragged into police custody like common criminals. It was an insult they could not erase. Inside their world, respect was everything, and respect had been shredded in Appalachin. The fallout would linger for years, fueling rivalries, grudges, and a deep mistrust of large gatherings. And yet, the very chaos of the raid underscored the paradox of the Mafia's power. For all the arrests, for all the evidence, the core of their empire remained intact. The unions, the rackets, the gambling dens, the narcotics pipelines, they did not vanish overnight. Apalachin had exposed the Mafia, but it had not destroyed it. The bosses would return to their cities, regroup, and adapt. But they would never again feel the same invincibility. The net had been cast once, and it could be cast again. For Genovese, the meeting's architect, the humiliation was especially sharp. He had orchestrated the gathering to solidify his power, to be recognized as the supreme leader. Instead, his ambition had brought ruin. His name, once feared, was now mocked in headlines. Instead of being crowned, he was blamed. His rivals, men like Carlo Gambino, watched and waited, quietly strengthening their own positions while Genovese's reputation crumbled. In his hunger for recognition, he had exposed the very empire he hoped to rule. In the months that followed, Appalachin became a rallying cry for law enforcement. Senators demanded investigations. Newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. And ordinary Americans, who had long heard whispers of organized crime, now had proof that the whispers were real. The Mafia was no myth. It was a national syndicate, and it had been caught in the act. The net had been cast, and though not every fish was captured, enough were caught to change history. Enough were caught to force the FBI to acknowledge what it had long denied. Enough were caught to remind the Mafia that even shadows can be pierced by light. Imagine, in the final hours of that day, the scene inside the police station. Dozens of powerful men sitting in chairs, their suits wrinkled, their faces grim. Troopers moving between them, asking questions, jotting notes. The room thick with tension, the air heavy with humiliation. Outside, reporters clamored for details, hungry for the story that would make headlines nationwide. Inside, the bosses waited, knowing their invisibility was gone, their myth broken, their dignity scarred. Appalachin was not the end of the Mafia. Far from it. But it was the end of their greatest weapon, the belief that they did not exist. From that day forward, they could never again hide behind denial. They had been caught in the net, and the world had seen them. The bosses would return to their cities, to their empires, to their rackets. But they returned changed. The fear of exposure lingered. The humiliation festered. The memory of running through fields, of being stopped by troopers, of being photographed like common criminals. These memories haunted them, and in those memories lay the beginning of a new chapter in the war between the Mafia and the law. Caught in the net, the Mafia had been forced into the open, and once dragged into the light, there was no going back into the shadows. The myth was dead. The empire was real, and America would never see it the same way again. Chapter 13, Names That Shocked America. The day after the raid, the headlines spread like wildfire. From New York to Chicago, from Los Angeles to Miami, newspapers screamed with astonishment. The photographs were grainy, the names sometimes misspelled, but the message was clear. The Mafia was real, it was organized, and it had been caught in one of the most humiliating exposures in criminal history. For decades, the underworld had thrived on invisibility. They were shadows behind the curtain, whispers in alleyways, legends told in the back pages of tabloids. But now their names were front-page news, and the country could not look away. It is hard to imagine the shock of that moment without remembering the America of the 1950s. This was a country that prided itself on suburban safety, on the clean image of post-war prosperity. Families watched Leave It to Beaver on television, believing in the myth of the perfect neighborhood. Men went to work in gray suits, women tended homes, children played baseball in empty lots. The Mafia existed in that world like a ghost, rumored but not believed, feared but never confirmed. And now, suddenly, the names and faces of those ghosts were staring back at America from the morning paper. The list read like a roll call of criminal royalty. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy, Stefano Megadino, Russell Buffalino, Vito Genovese. These are not small-time crooks. These were not neighborhood thugs shaking down shopkeepers. These were the architects of entire empires, men who controlled unions, ports, construction companies, gambling dens, and narcotics pipelines. Their reach stretched into Hollywood, Havana, Washington. And yet here they were, photographed and recorded in a small town in upstate New York, their invisibility torn away by a handful of state troopers. The American public could hardly process it. For years, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had insisted there was no such thing as a national crime syndicate. Hoover had mocked the very idea, dismissing talk of Mafia as fantasy. And now, in one afternoon, the lie was exposed. Ordinary citizens read the names and realized with a chill that these men had been living among them, pulling the strings of their cities, shaping their lives without ever being seen. Carlo Gambino, for example, had been a quiet presence for years, a fox who played the long game. To most Americans, his name meant nothing. But to law enforcement and insiders, his power was immense. He had carefully avoided the spotlight, letting louder men like Anastasia take the heat. Now, his presence in Appalachin revealed just how far he had risen. He was no longer a shadow. He was a player in the open, his name stamped into history. Joseph Bonanno was another shock. Known as the Gentleman Don, he prided himself on discretion, on keeping his family's affairs quiet and controlled. He lived with a kind of old-world dignity, presenting himself as a businessman, a family man. But his appearance in Appalachin proved that even the most careful bosses were tied to the larger syndicate. Bonanno could no longer claim distance. He was there, sitting alongside the rest, his name now part of the scandal. Joseph Prophesy, the olive oil king, seemed to embody respectability. His business empire was legitimate on the surface, his reputation that of a traditionalist. But his capture in Appalachin stripped away the facade. Prophesy was no harmless merchant. He was a mafia boss, his olive oil company as much a front as any gambling parlor. And then there was Stefano Megadino, the Buffalo Don, his roots stretching back to Sicily itself. Megadino represented the bridge between the old world and the new. He was feared for his cunning, respected for his longevity. His presence in Appalachin was a stark reminder that the Mafia was not just an American phenomenon. It was an international network, tied by blood and history to its Sicilian origins. Russell Buffalino, quieter but no less significant, was also on the list. His name meant little to the public then, but in later years his influence would be recognized as vast. He was a man of subtle power, a man who operated in whispers. His attendance at the meeting placed him in the spotlight for the first time, exposing the depth of his reach. And, of course, Vito Genovese. For him, Appalachin was supposed to be the crowning moment, the gathering that would secure his place as the undisputed leader. Instead, his name was splashed across headlines in the most humiliating fashion. Instead of being recognized by his peers as king, he was recognized by the world as reckless. The man who had schemed for power was now mocked, his ambition seen not as strength, but as arrogance. Chapter 14. Media Firestorm. The raid at Appalachin might have ended in the mud with men in wrinkled suits scrambling across farm fields, but the real explosion came the following morning, when the newspapers hit the stands. For decades, the Mafia had thrived on rumor and denial. It was the bogeyman in tavern whispers, the shadowy figure in pulp crime novels, the invisible hand pulling strings no one could quite prove. Then, almost overnight, the myth transformed into something undeniable. The headlines shouted it into American living rooms. Gangland summit smashed. 60 arrested in Mafia raid. Nationwide crime syndicate exposed. The media had found its story of the decade, and it sank its teeth in without mercy. The photographs alone were enough to shake the country. Grainy images of expensive cars lined up outside a farmhouse. Police leading well-dressed men into custody. A pile of hats, suits smeared with mud, the kind of humiliating details that made the mighty look small. These were not the faceless hoodlums Hoover had dismissed in speeches. These were men with names, men with reputations, men who had been dragged into daylight and forced to stumble like anyone else. The press loved it. The newspapers turned the Appalachin Meeting into a spectacle, and for the first time, ordinary Americans could put faces to the shadow empire. Radio broadcasts buzzed with updates. Newscasters' voices rose with urgency as they listed the names of those detained. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy, Stefano Megadino, Vito Genovese. To many listeners, these names meant little at first. But the sheer scale of it, the fact that so many powerful men had gathered together in one place, was enough to make it real. The Mafia wasn't just an urban legend anymore. It was a network, organized, nationwide, and the media made sure no one could deny it. Magazines took the story further. Time, Life, and others ran spreads filled with photos and illustrations, transforming the event into a cultural moment. They painted vivid pictures of mobsters fleeing through fields, their fine shoes caked in dirt, their expensive hats crushed underfoot. The contrast was irresistible. Men who lived like kings in the shadows now reduced to fugitives in farmland. It was theater, and the public couldn't get enough of it. But the firestorm wasn't just about humiliation. It was about fear. For years, Americans had lived with an uneasy sense that crime was bigger than what they saw on street corners. Stories of fixed boxing matches, stolen union pensions, and gambling dens had floated around, but they always seemed disconnected, isolated. Now the media connected the dots. The Mafia wasn't a handful of thugs. It was a syndicate, a national machine that touched shipping docks, construction sites, casinos, and politics. The Appalachin headlines made it clear. Organized crime wasn't lurking in the shadows anymore. It was embedded in the very fabric of American life. The coverage spread beyond the U.S. borders. International papers reported on the raid, astonished that America, the land of law and order, the country that preached democracy and justice to the world, had harbored a secret government of criminals. In Italy, where memories of Sicilian bosses still lingered, readers nodded knowingly. In Cuba, where mobsters had invested heavily in casinos, the Appalachin news sent ripples of anxiety through investors and politicians alike. The scandal was global, and it tarnished America's image abroad. The Mafia, of course, tried to fight back. Lawyers for the detained men insisted their clients were innocent, that they had merely been attending a friendly gathering, a social event, nothing more. A barbecue, some claimed. A visit to a sick friend, others said. But the press tore these excuses apart. Editorials mocked the absurdity of over 100 men in tailored suits descending on a small town for nothing more than ribs and conversation. Cartoonists lampooned mobsters in aprons, flipping steaks on grills, their fedoras tilted against the smoke. The Mafia's cover stories were not just weak, they were laughable. For Joseph Barbara, the host, the media firestorm was devastating. His name, once relatively obscure outside his community, became infamous. Newspapers plastered photos of his estate, calling it Gangland's conference hall, or the Mafia's boardroom. Reporters descended on Appalachin, interviewing neighbors, photographing the roads, examining the trampled fields. Barbara's health, already fragile from a heart attack earlier that year, collapsed further under the weight of exposure. To the press, he was not a man anymore. He was a symbol of the Mafia's arrogance, the man who had invited the underworld into the spotlight. For Vito Genovese, the firestorm was worse still. He had dreamed of Appalachin as his crowning moment, his coronation as boss of bosses. Instead, his name appeared in headlines as the architect of disaster. The media painted him not as a ruler, but as a reckless egomaniac whose hunger for power had dragged the Mafia into the light. Rivals like Carlo Gambino read those headlines with quiet satisfaction, knowing that every column inch weakened Genovese's grip. The firestorm also exposed Edgar Hoover's long-standing denial of organized crime. For years, the FBI director had insisted that the Mafia was a myth, a creation of pulp fiction and Hollywood. He had focused his resources on chasing communists while dismissing mobsters as small-time hoodlums. Now, with newspapers splashing photos of dozens of powerful men caught together in Apalachin. Hoover's position was untenable. Editorials mocked his blindness, some even hinting that his refusal to acknowledge the Mafia bordered on negligence. Hoover, enraged by the embarrassment, quietly shifted his bureau's focus. Appalachin had forced his hand. For the American people, reading these names was like peering into a hidden government. They learned that these men had controlled unions, dictated shipping schedules, manipulated construction projects, siphoned money from every corner of the economy. It was not just crime in alleys. It was crime woven into the fabric of daily life. A strike at the docks? Mafia influence. Delays in construction? Mafia control. The cost of food and clothing? Mafia skim. Suddenly, Americans realized that the underworld was not beneath them, but around them. The humiliation for the mobsters was immense. In their world, reputation was everything. Respect was currency. To be feared was to survive. And now, their names were mocked in newspapers, their faces ridiculed in photographs. They had been caught not in moments of triumph, but in moments of desperation, running, hiding, lying about barbecues. The carefully crafted image of dignity and strength crumbled overnight. Law enforcement seized the moment. Senators demanded hearings. State police departments across the country re-examined their files, realizing that the names from Appalachin matched names in their own investigations. For the first time, law enforcement agencies began to see the Mafia as a national network rather than scattered local gangs. The Appalachin list became a roadmap, a key to understanding the web of organized crime in America. But for the FBI, it was an embarrassment. Hoover had insisted for years that no such syndicate existed. Now the evidence was undeniable, and the press skewered him for his denial. The photographs of mobsters in Appalachin were a rebuke, proof that while Hoover chased communists, the Mafia had flourished unchecked. From that day forward, the FBI had no choice but to prioritize organized crime. The myth was shattered, and the Bureau could not afford to ignore any longer. The names also shook the mob itself. Trust began to erode. The bosses asked, who had made the mistake? Who had allowed the meeting to be compromised? Was it Barbara's estate, too obvious in its small-town setting? Was it Genovese's ambition, too reckless in its scale? Or was it fate, a single trooper who had seen too much? Whatever the answer, the result was clear. The Mafia had been exposed, and it would never be the same. Inside their world, grudges deepened. Some blamed Genovese, whispering that his hunger had doomed them all. Others quietly strengthened their own positions, preparing for the shifts in power that exposure would bring. Men like Gambino saw opportunity in the chaos, their patience paying dividends as rivals stumbled. Bonanno, ever cautious, pulled tighter into secrecy, determined never to be so vulnerable again. The fallout rippled through every family, reshaping alliances, sharpening rivalries. But for the public, it was simpler. They saw names and faces, once invisible, now undeniable. They saw the Mafia not as rumor, but as fact. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The Appalachin Meeting, meant to be a moment of consolidation, became instead the moment of exposure. The names written in police logs and printed in newspapers changed the narrative forever. America could no longer pretend the Mafia was just a story. It was real, it was national, and it had just been humiliated in the mud of upstate New York. In the end, the names mattered not just for who they were, but for what they represented. Each one was a thread in a vast web, a reminder that the Mafia was not a handful of thugs, but an empire woven into the nation itself. And the shock of seeing those names in black and white was enough to awaken a country that had been sleeping in the comfort of denial. The Mafia had thrived on being unseen. But at Appalachin, they were seen. They were named. They were exposed. And nothing, not silence, not fear, not even violence, could put the myth back together again. In homes across America, families read the headlines with a mix of fascination and dread. Housewives clipped newspaper articles and saved them. Fathers discussed the names at dinner tables, shaking their heads at the audacity of it all. Children whispered about gangsters, imagining them as villains from comic books suddenly made real. The Mafia was no longer a rumor. It was a household topic, part of the national conversation. Television, still in its golden age, played its part. News anchors described the raid in dramatic tones, the black and white footage adding weight to the story. For viewers who had grown used to images of war and politics, the sight of gangsters in handcuffs was shocking. The media turned Appalachin into a morality tale. No matter how powerful, no one is untouchable. The mobsters' mud-stained shoes and panicked escapes became metaphors for the fall of arrogance. And yet, for all its sensationalism, the firestorm carried truth. The Mafia was real. It was organized. It was national. The media, in amplifying the story, had shattered the last defense of denial. From that day forward, no one could seriously claim that organized crime was a myth. The veil had been lifted, and the country could not unsee what had been revealed. But exposure cut both ways. For the Mafia, the humiliation was deep, but so was the lesson. Never again would they allow such a gathering. Never again would so many bosses risk being seen together. The firestorm had shown them their weakness, and in time, they would adapt. They would retreat further into shadows, avoid spectacle, and tighten their secrecy. The press had dragged them into the light. But light burns fast, and shadows always find a way to return. Still, the damage was done. The names, the photographs, the stories, they could never be erased. The Appalachin Meeting became shorthand for arrogance, for overreach, for the day the Mafia stumbled. Every time another mobster was arrested in the years that followed, reporters traced the line back to Appalachin, back to the farmhouse in upstate New York where the underworld was first exposed. The media firestorm was relentless. For weeks, newspapers printed follow-ups, digging into the lives of the men who had been detained. Who were they? Where did they live? What businesses did they control? Suddenly, the invisible web of influence began to take shape in the public eye. Articles explained how unions were manipulated, how construction projects were siphoned, how gambling dens fed money into mafia coffers. The story evolved from spectacle to education, teaching Americans how deeply crime had seeped into their world. For the mobsters, it was a nightmare that would not end. Their wives read their names in papers. Their children heard classmates whispering at school. Their neighbors looked at them differently. Respect, once commanded through silence and fear, was undermined by ridicule. The firestorm had done what bullets never could. It had stripped the Mafia of its aura of invincibility. The storm raged on, and when it finally began to calm, the landscape had changed. The Mafia was still powerful, still wealthy, still dangerous. But it was no longer invisible. The press had shown the country what lurked in the shadows, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The media firestorm turned Appalachin from a local raid into a national reckoning. It was not just a story, it was a revelation. And in that revelation lay the Mafia's greatest humiliation and law enforcement's greatest opportunity. The empire of silence had been broken, and though the Mafia would rebuild, though it would adapt and endure, the headlines from November 1957 ensured that the world would never again believe in its invisibility. The names were known, the faces were seen, and the shadows would never feel quite as safe again. Chapter 15, Denials and Cover Stories. The morning after the raid, as the mud dried in the fields of Appalachin and the photographs of suited men stumbling through farmland splashed across front pages, a new performance began. It wasn't the spectacle of the getaway, nor the chaos of the raid. This was quieter, subtler, but no less desperate. The Mafia had been caught in the open, its most powerful men humiliated before the eyes of the nation. And so the bosses turned to their oldest tool, the art of denial. Every man detained that day emerged from custody armed with a story. Some were laughable, others carefully rehearsed, but all shared a single aim: to distance themselves from the word mafia. If the headlines screamed organized crime, the mobsters whispered otherwise. To the police, to the press, to anyone who would listen, they claimed innocence, insisting that Appalachin was not what it appeared to be. The most common story was almost absurd in its simplicity: a barbecue. That was the line. Over 100 men from across the country, men with reputations in gambling, extortion, narcotics, and unions, just happened to gather in rural New York for a cookout. They weren't there to discuss narcotics pipelines or carve up Anastasia's rackets. They insisted. No, they were there for steaks and sausages, for the warmth of friendship, for a bit of fresh air away from the city. It was a lie so thin it collapsed under its own weight. But they repeated it nonetheless, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Others leaned on a different story: loyalty to a sick friend. Joseph Barbara, the host, had suffered a heart attack earlier that year. His health was fragile, his days uncertain. According to those who spoke on his behalf, the gathering was nothing more than friends and associates visiting him in his time of need. A gesture of respect, nothing sinister. Yet the sheer number of well-wishers who descended on his estate stretched the lie beyond belief. No one needed over 100 guests to offer sympathy, especially not guests arriving in fleets of Cadillacs and Lincolns from across the country. Some claimed coincidence. They were passing through, they said. They happened to be in the area. They had business nearby. The excuses varied, but the intent was the same: to transform the image of mobsters scattering through the woods into something ordinary, unremarkable. If they could muddy the narrative, blur the sharp lines of exposure, perhaps they could reclaim some dignity. But the denials carried a stench of panic. For men who prided themselves on control, on measured words and calculated silence, their stories came too fast, too rehearsed, too flimsy. Law enforcement officers, who had seen hardened criminals maintain cool defiance in interrogation rooms, recognized the difference. These weren't calm lies. They were desperate cover stories, stitched together in haste. And the more they spoke, the deeper they dug their own graves. The press was merciless. Reporters mocked the barbecue story, cartoonists drawing mobsters in aprons flipping steaks, Tommy guns slung over their shoulders, bottles of wine at their feet. Editorials ridiculed the idea of coincidence, pointing out how unlikely it was for powerful men from New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Florida to all pass through Appalachin on the same day. The Mafia's denials, meant to protect, instead fueled the firestorm. Their refusal to admit what everyone could see only made them look weaker. For Joseph Barbara, the denials were personal. His name had become synonymous with the debacle, his estate forever branded as the stage for the Mafia's exposure. His health, already poor, crumbled further under the strain. From his sickbed, he tried to maintain the fiction, insisting that he was simply a host, that the gathering was harmless. But his neighbors had seen too much. They had watched the cars pour in, the men scatter, the troopers give chase. No denial could erase the memory of mud-stained suits crashing through fences. Barbara's estate, once a symbol of his prosperity, had become a monument to humiliation. For Vito Genovese, the orchestrator, the denials were a bitter reminder of his failure. He had summoned the meeting to consolidate power, to be recognized as the supreme leader. Now his name was tangled in excuses that sounded ridiculous even to his own ears. Instead of a coronation, he faced mockery. The very men he hoped to rule whispered that his recklessness had doomed them all. His ambition, meant to elevate, had exposed. Inside the Mafia itself, the denials were more than a public front. They were a test of loyalty. Every man detained had to maintain the cover story, to stick to the script no matter how implausible it sounded. To admit the truth, even in private, was to risk betrayal. And so they held firm, repeating the lies in interrogation rooms, to reporters, even to family. The story was fragile, but it was shared, and in sharing it, they maintained the one thing they still had: silence about the truth. Law enforcement, for its part, knew the denials were false, but proving otherwise was harder. Many of those detained were released without charges. Some cases fell apart in court for lack of hard evidence. The Mafia had been exposed, yes, but exposure did not equal conviction. In a cruel irony, the very implausibility of the denials sometimes worked in their favor. Judges and juries, bound by evidence, could not convict men for being at a barbecue, no matter how ridiculous the story sounded. The Mafia slipped through the cracks of the legal system, even as its invisibility collapsed in the court of public opinion. Yet the damage was done. The denials did not convince the public. They did not restore the myth of invincibility. Instead, they highlighted the Mafia's vulnerability. For decades, silence had been their weapon. They had built power by saying nothing, by denying everything, by letting fear do the talking. But Apalachin had forced them to speak, and in speaking, they revealed their desperation. The lies became proof of weakness, evidence that even the most powerful men in America could be cornered and made to scramble. The fallout lingered. Newspapers revisited the barbecue story for years, using it as shorthand for Mafia denial. Whenever another mobster was caught, reporters joked about the next barbecue. The phrase became a cultural punchline, a scar that the Mafia could never fully erase. Their attempt at cover stories had backfired, turning humiliation into legend. Inside the underworld, the lesson was clear: never again. Never again would so many gather in one place. Never again would cover stories be needed on such a scale. Never again would they risk being seen together. From Appalachin forward, Mafia meetings were smaller, quieter, hidden in layers of secrecy. The denial had failed, but the lesson endured. For the American public, the denials revealed something deeper. They showed that the Mafia was not all-powerful, not beyond reach. These men, for all their money and muscle, could be reduced to weak excuses and laughable lies. The illusion of control was gone, and once gone, it could never fully return. The chapter of denials and cover stories was not just about lies told to police. It was about the shattering of a myth. It was about watching kings reduced to clowns, rulers of shadows caught fumbling for words in the daylight. Their excuses rang hollow, and in their hollowness, America heard the truth. The Mafia was real, it was fragile, and it could be exposed. Appalachin was their great humiliation, and the denials only deepened the wound. The men who had once commanded fear with silence found themselves mocked for their words. And though they would adapt, though they would rebuild, they would never again believe in their own invisibility. The denials were supposed to save them. Instead, they sealed their shame, and the world, watching with fascination, never forgot the sound of powerful men insisting they were only there for a barbecue. Chapter 16, Federal Awakening. The shockwaves from Appalachin did not stop in the rolling hills of upstate New York. They did not end with the muddy suits, the confiscated Cadillacs, or the grainy photographs plastered across newspapers. No, the true impact came weeks later, when the echoes of that November afternoon finally reached Washington. For decades, the FBI had insisted that the Mafia was little more than myth, a figment of imagination blown out of proportion by pulp magazines and Hollywood films. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful lawman in America, had built his reputation on hunting radicals, communists, and bank robbers, not mobsters. To him, organized crime on national scale was a distraction from the battles he wanted to fight. But Appalachin changed everything. The denials, the lies about a barbecue, the images of powerful men sprinting through cow pastures, it all became too much to ignore. Hoover, who had mocked the very idea of a nationwide syndicate, now found himself humiliated. The headlines made him look blind, even complicit. State troopers with a fraction of the FBI's resources had managed to stumble upon proof of what Hoover had long denied. And the country wanted answers. The media firestorm had already cornered the Bureau. Questions poured in from reporters and senators alike. How had the FBI, with all its manpower and funding, failed to see what a handful of New York troopers had uncovered? Why had Hoover insisted for years that the Mafia did not exist when over 100 of its most powerful men had been photographed in one place? And perhaps most damning of all, if the Bureau could not protect Americans from a criminal government operating in the shadows, what good was it? Hoover, ever conscious of his image, felt the sting. His carefully crafted reputation as the nation's protector was in jeopardy. And so, reluctantly, he pivoted. Apalachin forced a federal awakening, a shift that would transform the fight against organized crime for decades to come. The first step was recognition. For the very first time, the FBI publicly acknowledged that organized crime was real and that it operated on a national scale. It was not simply a series of local gangs, not a collection of unrelated criminals. It was a network, tied together by blood, money, and secrecy. The commission, once whispered about in back alleys, was now recognized as the ruling council of America's underworld. Appalachin had pulled it into the daylight, and the Bureau had no choice but to admit it. But recognition was not enough. Hoover, smarting from humiliation, launched new initiatives designed to reassert control. He ordered his agents to begin collecting intelligence on mob figures, building files not just on their arrests but on their movements, their families, their businesses. Wiretaps, long resisted, began to creep into the Bureau's arsenal. Informants were cultivated, pressured, and flipped. The silence that had protected the Mafia for so long now had cracks, and the FBI was determined to widen them. Congress, too, smelled blood. Embarrassed by the exposure, lawmakers demanded action. Hearings were held. Senators grilled witnesses, waved photographs from Appalachin, and demanded answers from federal agencies. Why had it taken so long to recognize the Mafia? How could men like Gambino and Genovese operate openly for decades without interference? These hearings, fueled by outrage, laid the groundwork for laws that would later become the government's most powerful weapons against organized crime. The seeds of the RICO Act, legislation that would eventually dismantle entire Mafia families, were planted in the fertile soil of Appalachin. It would take years, even decades, before those seeds bore fruit, but the direction was clear. The days of denial were over. The federal government could no longer pretend the Mafia did not exist. For the mobsters, the federal awakening was a nightmare. For decades, they had relied on Hoover's indifference, confident that the FBI would not come knocking at their doors. Local police could be bribed. Judges could be influenced. Politicians could be bought. But the FBI, with its national reach, was something else entirely. Once Hoover shifted his gaze, the underworld's breathing space shrank dramatically. The bosses who had once walked invisibly through cities now found themselves followed, photographed, documented. Their phone calls were tapped. Their lieutenants were pressured. Their secrecy, once absolute, was now fragile. But it wasn't just the FBI that woke up. The public, too, had been jolted into awareness. Ordinary Americans, who had once dismissed talk of the Mafia as rumor, now saw its leaders paraded in headlines. They realized that crime wasn't just something that happened in dark alleys. It was embedded in their unions, their industries, their politics. The myth of safety, of separation between honest society and the underworld, crumbled. The Mafia wasn't just out there somewhere. It was here, woven into the very structure of the nation. Hoover, ever the strategist, understood the importance of narrative. If he was to recover from the humiliation of Appalachin, he needed to show results. He ordered agents to launch visible campaigns, to make arrests, to gather evidence that could be splashed across newspapers as proof that the FBI was back in control. Suddenly, mobsters who had lived comfortably for years found themselves targeted in raids, their businesses disrupted, their associates questioned. It was not always effective, not always precise, but it was relentless. And yet, Hoover's change of heart was not driven by justice alone. It was driven by ego. The Appalachin Meeting had embarrassed him, and Hoover never forgave embarrassment. His bureau had been made to look blind while small-town troopers stole the spotlight. That sting fueled the FBI's newfound focus. It wasn't just about dismantling the Mafia. It was about reclaiming prestige. In that sense, the federal awakening was as much personal as it was institutional. For the Mafia, adapting to this new reality became essential. Gone were the days of large gatherings, of overt displays of unity. Never again would so many bosses risk being photographed together. Meetings became smaller, more discreet, held in safe houses, restaurants, or even abroad. The commission still existed, but its gatherings became whispers, shadows of the grand assembly in Appalachin. The lesson had been learned. Visibility was fatal. But even as they adapted, the damage was irreversible. The Federal Awakening meant that the Mafia would never again enjoy the same freedom it had before Appalachin. Every move, every racket, every whispered deal was now under threat of exposure. The Bureau's files grew thicker with each passing year. Its network of informants expanded, its strategies sharpened. The noose, once invisible, had begun to tighten. Yet for all the Federal Awakening accomplished, it also bred resentment. Some mobsters, humiliated and cornered, lashed out. Violence flared in the years after Appalachin, as families jockeyed for power and sought to reassert dominance in the face of federal pressure. Genovese himself, once poised to rule, found his empire under siege not only from rivals, but from prosecutors emboldened by the raid. His dream of supremacy crumbled, and his name became synonymous not with triumph, but with downfall. In hindsight, Appalachin stands as the turning point. Before, the Mafia operated in near-mythical invisibility, shielded by silence and denial. After, it was a recognized enemy of the state, hunted by the FBI, scrutinized by the press, feared by the public. The Federal Awakening did not destroy the Mafia overnight. It would take decades of battles, laws, and trials to bring it to its knees. But the direction was set. The tide had turned. Picture Hoover in his office in Washington, poring over the reports from Appalachin, his jaw tight, his pride wounded. For years, he had laughed at the idea of a national syndicate. Now the evidence sat before him, undeniable, humiliating. In that moment, history pivoted. The Bureau's gaze shifted, and with it, the Mafia's fate. For the men who had scattered through barbarous fields, the realization came slowly. The raid itself had been a humiliation. The headlines had been awound. But the Federal Awakening was the true disaster. It meant that the shadows were gone, that the silence could no longer protect them. It meant that the most powerful law enforcement machine in America was now aimed directly at them. And in the years that followed, the Mafia would feel the weight of that awakening. Case by case, trial by trial, conviction by conviction. Appalachin had ripped away their invisibility. The FBI, embarrassed and enraged, would spend the next decades ensuring they never got it back. The Federal Awakening was not a choice. It was a reaction, forced by exposure, fueled by humiliation, and carried out with relentless determination. It reshaped the battle between law and crime, between shadows and light. And though the Mafia would fight back, adapt, and endure, it would never again move so freely. On that November day, it was state troopers who caught the mob. But in the days that followed, it was the federal government that awoke. And once awake, it would never again close its eyes. Chapter 17. Fallout for Vito Genovese. The man who had dreamed of Appalachin the most walked away with the most to lose. Vito Genovese had spent his entire life clawing his way back to power, plotting in the shadows, biding his time until the crown was finally his. The Appalachin Meeting, in his mind, was meant to be his coronation. He had toppled Frank Costello, forced the old prime minister of the Mafia into retirement with a single bullet grazing his skull. He had maneuvered his way into controlling one of the most powerful families in New York. And now, in November of 1957, Genovese believed the stage was set for him to be recognized, not just as a boss, but the boss, the undisputed head of the national crime syndicate. Instead, Appalachin became the greatest humiliation of his career. When the troopers descended on Joseph Barbara's estate, when the bosses scattered into the mud and fields, when the photographs of captured mobsters splashed across the front pages, the man who had orchestrated it all found himself blamed. Not just by law enforcement, not just by the press, but by his own peers. For years, the Mafia had thrived on invisibility. Now, because of Genovese's hunger, that invisibility had been torn away. The bosses, who had come to upstate New York reluctantly, out of fear of being seen as disloyal, returned to their cities furious, muttering his name like a curse. Genovese's ambition had always been obvious. He was not a subtle man like Carlo Gambino, nor a diplomat like Joseph Bonanno. He was blunt, forceful, a man who believed that fear was stronger than friendship. For some, that made him effective. For others, it made him dangerous. And after Apalachin, it made him vulnerable. In the weeks following the raid, newspapers painted him as the architect of the disaster. His name was tied to every story, every editorial, every political speech about organized crime. Senators mentioned him in hearings. Law enforcement officers pointed to him in interviews. Even ordinary Americans, who had never heard his name before, now associated him with the Mafia's exposure. For a man obsessed with reputation and respect, it was a brutal blow. But worse than the public humiliation was the quiet reckoning within the Mafia itself. Behind closed doors, bosses whispered that Genovese had overreached. They said he had gathered too many men in one place, that his arrogance had blinded him to the risks. Some even speculated that the meeting itself was cursed, that fate had intervened to humble him. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Genovese's dream of being crowned Capo di Tutti Capi crumbled in the mud of Appalachin. The fallout came swiftly. Rivals who had once tolerated his rise now saw an opening. Carlo Gambino, patient and calculating, strengthened his position quietly, letting Genovese take the blame while he maneuvered into greater power. Joseph Bonanno, always cautious, distanced himself from Genovese's reckless style, preferring to cultivate his image as the reasonable, gentlemanly Don. Even allies began to drift away, unwilling to tie themselves to a man whose ambition had exposed them all. Law enforcement, too, smelled blood. For years, Genovese had evaded serious prosecution, his wealth and influence insulating him from the courts. But after Appalachin, prosecutors saw him differently. He was no longer an untouchable boss. He was a target. Investigations into his operations intensified. Informants were pressured to talk. Cases that had once languished suddenly found new energy. The man who had orchestrated the largest Mafia summit in history now found himself under siege. The irony of Genovese's downfall is almost poetic. He had spent years in exile in Italy during World War II, cultivating connections with Mussolini's regime, only to be deported back to the United States. He had clawed his way back into power through violence, intimidation, and cunning. He had outmaneuvered Costello, weathered assassination attempts, and bullied his way into control of the family. And yet, at the height of his ambition, it was not a bullet or betrayal that undid him. It was humiliation. It was the spectacle of his peers running like frightened men, their names exposed, their power mocked. It was the fallout from a single afternoon in a small town that cracked the foundation of his empire. Chapter 18, Long Arm of the Law. The raid at Appalachin was supposed to be a single day in November. A disruption, an embarrassment, a story that might fade once the headlines grew stale. But the truth is, what happened on Joseph Barbara's estate in 1957 was not a single event. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. The Mafia had thrived for decades under the cloak of invisibility, but once that cloak was torn away, the law never stopped reaching for them. The long arm of justice, once hesitant and uncertain, stretched further and further into the underworld. And though it didn't strangle the Mafia overnight, it squeezed hard enough to change everything. The immediate aftermath of Appalachin was chaos in courtrooms and police stations across the country. Nearly 60 mobsters have been detained or identified. Some were indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruction. The cases were clumsy, often falling apart in court. Judges demanded hard evidence of crimes, not just proof that men had been seen together. Defense attorneys had a field day, arguing that attending a barbecue, even one with over 100 gangsters in attendance, was not a crime, and many of the charges didn't stick. One by one, indictments were dropped, cases dismissed. On the surface, it looked like the mobsters had slipped away again. But law enforcement had learned something invaluable. Names, faces, connections. The raid gave investigators a map of the Mafia that they had never possessed before. Files began to swell with photographs, license plate numbers, and lists of attendees. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy, Stefano Megadino, Russell Buffalino, Vito Genovese. These were not faceless rumors anymore. They were real men, tied to real places, caught together in the act of conspiring. Even if convictions were elusive, the evidence of their existence was undeniable. The myth of organized crime doesn't exist had been shattered forever. The state troopers in New York had done what the FBI had refused to do, expose the Mafia. And that exposure forced the Bureau's hand. Edgar Hoover, long reluctant to acknowledge the syndicate, could no longer hide behind denial. The press mocked him. Senators grilled him. Public opinion demanded action. And so, begrudgingly, Hoover redirected his agents. Apalachin had embarrassed him, but it also gave him an opportunity to claim the mantle of the man who would bring the Mafia to its knees. From that point forward, the federal government's approach to organized crime began to shift. Task forces were created. Investigations broadened. For the first time, the Bureau began to see the Mafia not as isolated gangs, but as a national network. They studied the Appalachin attendees like zoologists examining a new species. Patterns emerged. Alliances became clear. The Commission, once a whispered rumor, now had definition. And the law's arm, slow but steady, reached deeper into the syndicate's veins. Congress, too, responded with fury. The spectacle of mobsters fleeing through fields had humiliated the country, and senators wanted answers. Hearings were convened. Lawmakers demanded stronger tools to fight organized crime. Out of this pressure came the groundwork for laws that would, in time, cripple the Mafia's power. The Appalachin Meeting, absurd as it seemed at first glance, became the catalyst for the development of new legal weapons. Laws that would eventually evolve into the RICO Act of 1970, a statute designed to dismantle entire criminal organizations rather than chase individual crimes. The long arm of the law extended not just through statutes, but through surveillance. Wiretaps, once rare and controversial, became more common. The Bureau began listening. They tapped phones in restaurants, bars, and homes. They bugged cars, hotel rooms, even lampposts outside social clubs. The mob's greatest weapon had always been its silence. Omerta, the code of secrecy. But technology was beginning to chip away at it. Conversations once thought private were recorded and transcribed. The words of powerful bosses reduced to evidence in manila folders. Informants, too, became vital. Appalachin had shaken the confidence of many in the underworld. Fear of exposure spread. Some, facing their own indictments, began to talk. Others, threatened with prison, traded secrets for leniency. The code of silence cracked, not in a flood, but in small fractures that widened over time. Each betrayal, each whisper, gave law enforcement more reach. The long arm was no longer just external. It was now reaching inside the Mafia itself. The mobsters, of course, pushed back. They hired the best lawyers money could buy. They bribed judges, leaned on politicians, intimidated witnesses. And for a time, they still seemed untouchable. Many of the Appalachin defendants walked free. The Mafia continued to rake in profits from gambling, narcotics, labor rackets, and loan sharking. The long arm reached, but the Mafia still slipped through its fingers again and again. Yet, even in those apparent victories, something had shifted. The illusion of invincibility was gone. Every man who had been seen at Appalachin carried the stain of exposure. Every time they met with associates, every time they stepped into public, they wondered who was watching. By 1959, just 2 years after Appalachin, Genovese's enemies made their move. He was indicted on narcotics charges, accused of trafficking heroin, a business he had championed. Even his other bosses warned it was too risky. The trial was swift, the evidence damning. Some whispered that his conviction had been arranged by his rivals, who had fed information to prosecutors to ensure his downfall. Whether true or not, the result was the same. Vito Genovese, the man who had once dreamed of ruling the underworld, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The fallout from Apalachin had come full circle. The meeting that was meant to crown him had instead set the stage for his ruin. From his cell, Genovese watched as his rivals rose in his absence. Gambino, once patient in the shadows, consolidated his power and became the true head of the commission. Bonanno continued to cultivate his image as a statesman of the Mafia. Even men like Russell Bufalino, less known to the public, gained influence while Genovese languished behind bars. Inside prison, Genovese tried to maintain his authority. He held meetings, issued orders, and sought to control his family from behind walls. But his power was diminished. The respect he craved had been tarnished at Appalachin, and prison only deepened the wound. For a man who had lived his life demanding fear and obedience, being caged was the ultimate insult. And yet, even in his downfall, Genovese remained dangerous. Rumors swirled that he ordered hits from inside prison, that he sought revenge against those who had betrayed him. Some said he never stopped plotting, never stopped hungering for the power that had slipped through his fingers. But history remembers him not as the triumphant boss of bosses, but as the man whose ambition lit the fuse that exploded at Appalachin. The fallout for Genovese was more than personal. It was symbolic. His rise and fall embodied the turning point in America's relationship with organized crime. Before Appalachin, the Mafia had thrived in shadows, its leaders able to deny their existence with impunity. After Appalachin, that invisibility was gone, and Genovese, the man who had tried to rule the Mafia like a monarch, became the face of its exposure. In the years that followed, the story of Appalachin was retold again and again, each time with Genovese at its center. Reporters painted him as the reckless architect, the man whose arrogance had dragged the underworld into the light. Law enforcement used his name as a warning, proof that even the most powerful boss could be brought low. His rivals used his downfall as a stepping stone, strengthening their own empires in the void he left behind. For Genovese himself, the bitterness never faded. He died in prison in 1969, still clinging to the belief that he had been betrayed, still seething with the humiliation of Appalachin. His dream of being the undisputed ruler of the Mafia had turned to ash, undone not by bullets, but by exposure, by headlines, by the laughter of a public who saw gangsters running through fields like frightened boys. The fallout of Appalachin destroyed more than just one man's reputation. It destroyed the illusion of invincibility that had shielded the Mafia for decades. And for Vito Genovese, the man who had believed he could seize the crown, it destroyed everything he had spent a lifetime building. Appalachin was supposed to make him king. Instead, it made him a cautionary tale. And in the underworld, where respect is everything, there is no fate crueler than that. Chapter 19. Changing the Mafia forever. The raid at Appalachin did not kill the Mafia. That would have been too simple, too clean, too final for an organization woven so deeply into the fabric of American life. The mob survived the chaos of that November day, survived the headlines, survived the hearings. But survival did not mean unchanged. Appalachin reshaped the underworld in ways no bullet ever could. It forced the bosses to adapt, to rethink, to evolve. The Mafia that walked out of Appalachin, mud-stained and humiliated, would never again be the same. The first and most obvious change was in their gatherings. Never again would the commission, or any large collection of bosses, risk meeting in such numbers. The sight of over 100 mobsters crammed into one estate had been too much, too visible, too arrogant. Appalachin taught them that visibility was fatal. Afterward, meetings shrank. Conversations moved from mansions to restaurants, from estates to backrooms, from public displays to private whispers. Safe houses were chosen with extreme care, often changing locations at the last minute. Delegates would represent families rather than entire entourages, keeping numbers small. The Mafia, once unafraid to parade its power among its own, now treated secrecy not as a habit, but as a matter of survival. This shift in behavior created a new style of leadership. The old guard, Men like Albert Anastasia had relied on intimidation, on open displays of violence and dominance. But Appalachin revealed that such arrogance carried risk. In the years that followed, the most successful bosses were the ones who moved quietly, who kept their names out of headlines, who treated invisibility as armor. Carlo Gambino embodied this perfectly. Patient, calculating, soft-spoken, Gambino learned the lesson of Appalachin better than anyone. While Genovese collapsed under the weight of exposure, Gambino thrived in the shadows, consolidating power without drawing attention. In many ways, Appalachin cleared the path for his rise. The Mafia also changed the way it communicated. Before, orders might pass face-to-face in large meetings, with capos and underbosses gathered around table. After Appalachin, bosses avoided such assemblies. Messages traveled indirectly, passed down through soldiers, through trusted intermediaries, through layers designed to keep the top insulated from exposure. Codes were tightened. Phones, already distrusted, became even more dangerous with the rise of wiretaps. Silence grew heavier, enforced more ruthlessly. Omerta, the code of silence, had always been sacred, but now it became survival itself. A single slip of the tongue, a single overheard word, could undo what shadows still remained. Even the rituals of daily life shifted. Social clubs, once the hub of Mafia culture, became more closely watched by law enforcement. Men who had once lounged in backrooms now took greater care, limiting who could enter, who could sit, who could listen. Restaurants, bars, even family dinners became potential risks. The Mafia learned to live with suspicion, to scan every room, to measure every glance. The paranoia born in Appalachin seeped into their bones and never left. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Appalachin humiliated them. For decades, the Mafia had been feared not only because of its power, but because of its mystique. They were untouchable, unseen, the invisible government. Respect came as much from the myth as from the reality. When the public saw them sprinting through fields, tumbling over fences, hiding in hedges, that myth cracked. When newspapers mocked them with cartoons of mobsters flipping hamburgers at a barbecue, their aura of dignity was shattered. They could still kill, still extort, still control unions, but the fear was never quite the same. They had been seen running, and once seen, it could never be unseen. This loss of myth reverberated inside the underworld as well. Within their own ranks, the bosses carried the sting of that humiliation. Appalachin became a cautionary tale, whispered in backrooms as a reminder of what arrogance could cost. No one wanted to be the next Barbara, the next Genovese, the next fool who drew the spotlight. Ambition did not die, but it learned patience. Power grabs became quieter, subtler, masked by diplomacy rather than brute force. The law, too, had changed, and the Mafia knew it. Appalachin had jolted the FBI from denial into action. Federal task forces began mapping the families, building files, cultivating informants. Congress pushed for stronger laws, eventually creating RICO, a tool designed to dismantle entire organizations rather than chase single crimes. The Mafia could feel the long arm of the law stretching toward them. Every phone call, every meeting, every business deal carried the weight of risk. They adapted by burrowing deeper into legitimate industries, construction, trucking, waste management, where profit was steady and less visible. Gambling and narcotics still flowed, but fronts became more sophisticated, more entangled with the respectable world. The line between crime and business blurred further than ever before. For Genovese, the fallout was immediate and brutal. His dream of being crowned boss of bosses had backfired spectacularly. Law enforcement zeroed in on him, prosecutors eager to make an example. By 1959, he was convicted on narcotics charges and sent to prison, his power shattered. He would never walk free again. The long arm of the law had not reached him in Appalachin, but the exposure made him a marked man. His downfall was a direct result of the raid, proof that even the most feared Don could be dragged down. But Genovese was not the only one. Other bosses found their movements monitored, their businesses scrutinized. Men who had once operated in silence now had reporters camped outside their homes, cameras flashing when they appeared in court. Each headline chipped away at the myth. Each arrest, even if temporary, reminded the public that the Mafia was real and vulnerable. The Mafia tried to adapt. Never again would they hold such a gathering. Never again would so many bosses be in one place at one time. Meetings became smaller, quieter, hidden. They relied more heavily on trusted intermediaries, communicating through layers of lieutenants to avoid detection. The commission still existed, but it moved like smoke, harder to see, harder to catch. Yet the very need to change proved that the long arm had done its work. Apalachin had forced the Mafia into retreat. And it wasn't just the bosses who felt the pressure. Soldiers, capos, and associates, men who had once blended into the background, found themselves pulled into the spotlight. The FBI compiled lists, created organizational charts, mapped families like corporate structures. For the first time, the government began to understand the Mafia as a system, not just a collection of crimes. That shift in perspective, born from the raid, made the law's reach more strategic, more dangerous. Still, the Mafia endured. Through the 1960s, they profited from labor racketeering, infiltrated Hollywood, expanded their grip on Las Vegas. The long arm of the law reached, but it was not yet strong enough to crush them. It would take years of surveillance, decades of legal innovation, and the eventual testimony of high-ranking defectors before the syndicate truly began to crumble. But Appalachin was the spark. It was the moment when the law stopped pretending the Mafia didn't exist and started building the tools to fight it. The irony is sharp. The mobsters had gathered in Appalachin to solidify power, to divide territories, to crown a king. Instead, they had handed the law everything it needed. Their arrogance gave investigators proof. Their flight gave the press spectacle. Their denials gave comedians punchlines. And their presence together gave prosecutors the roadmap to an empire. The Mafia had sought to unify itself, but in doing so, it unified the law against it. In the end, the long arm of the law was not a single strike. It was not the raid itself, nor the first wave of indictments, nor even the downfall of Vito Genovese. It was the slow, relentless tightening of a grip that began that November afternoon and never let go. Each investigation, each law passed, each wiretap, each defector, it all traced back to Appalachin, to the day the Mafia was caught out in the open. Picture it, the bosses fleeing through muddy fields, their polished shoes ruined, their dignity shredded. They thought the humiliation would pass, that they could deny and distract until the storm faded. But the storm did not fade. It grew. It spread. It reached into courtrooms, Congress, and the FBI. It stretched into every corner of their lives until no shadow felt safe. The long arm of the law had awakened. And once stretched, it never withdrew. Appalachin did not end the Mafia, but it ended their invisibility. And for men who had built empires on silence and shadows, that was the beginning of the end. The Mafia also adjusted its international strategy. Appalachin had revealed how vulnerable they were on American soil, so connections abroad became more important. Havana, though soon lost to Castro's revolution, had been a jewel. After its fall, the mob sought new havens in the Caribbean and South America. In Sicily, ties remained strong, with narcotics pipelines running across oceans. The Mafia became more global, less centralized in New York, less dependent on visible gatherings. In many ways, Appalachin pushed them outward, forcing them to evolve into a transnational network. But not all changes were strategic. Some were personal. Joseph Barbara, whose estate had hosted the disaster, never recovered. His health deteriorated, his reputation ruined, his name forever tied to the meeting. He died a broken man in 1959, remembered not as a boss, but as a fool. Vito Genovese, the man who had dreamed of Appalachin as his coronation, instead saw it mark the beginning of his downfall. By 1959, He was in prison on narcotics charges, his power fractured. The men who replaced him, Gambino, Bonanno, others, learned from his mistake. They ruled with quieter hands, their ambition masked by caution. Even within families, Appalachin shifted dynamics. Soldiers and capos saw their bosses humiliated, saw the myth of invincibility crumble. Some began to question loyalties. Others began to look for exits, turning informant when the pressure of law enforcement grew too great. The cracks widened over time, leading eventually to high-profile betrayals in later decades. Joe Valachi in the 1960s, Sammy Gravano in the 1990s. Apalachin didn't create betrayal, but planted seeds of doubt. It showed that the Mafia was not all-powerful, that its leaders could be caught, that silence could be broken. The cultural impact was equally significant. Hollywood, always hungry for stories, seized on the spectacle. Films and television shows began weaving the Mafia into American mythology, blending fact and fiction. The idea of mobsters as shadowy rulers gained new traction, no longer dismissed as pulp fantasy. Appalachin gave crime drama its rawest material. Real names, real faces, real images of gangsters fleeing through fields. The Mafia became not just a criminal syndicate, but a cultural phenomenon, its story told and retold in ways that shaped how America imagined itself. And in that cultural mirror, the Mafia adapted once again. They leaned into the myth when it suited them, letting the Hollywood image of the gangster feed fear. But they also recoiled from it, wary of drawing too much attention. It was a paradox. Appalachin had made them both famous and vulnerable, and they spent the next decades balancing those twin realities. Ultimately, the most lasting change was the loss of invisibility. Before Appalachin, the Mafia lived in the shadows, their existence denied even by the FBI. After Appalachin, they were real. They were documented. They were known. That shift could never be undone. The law would chase them harder. The press would watch them closer. The public would fear them less. And within their own ranks, the sting of humiliation would remind them, again and again, of the cost of arrogance. Appalachin did not destroy the Mafia. It forced it to evolve. It forced it to retreat into deeper shadows, to adapt to new pressures, to rethink how power was displayed and maintained. It changed the trajectory of organized crime in America, reshaping it into something leaner, quieter, but no less dangerous. The raid in that small town was supposed to be a momentary disruption. Instead, it became a dividing line. There was the Mafia before Appalachin, bold, visible, arrogant. And there was the Mafia after Appalachin, cautious, paranoid, adaptive. That November day in 1957 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. And though the mob would endure for decades, its golden age of invisibility died in the mud outside Joseph Barbara's estate. Appalachin changed the Mafia forever. And nothing, not silence, not fear, not power, could ever turn back the clock. Chapter 20, Legacy of Appalachin. The Appalachin Meeting began as a quiet gathering in the hills of upstate New York, meant to be a coronation for Vito Genovese, a demonstration of power, a moment of unity for the American Mafia. Instead, it became the most infamous debacle in organized crime history, a single afternoon that ripped the veil of secrecy off an empire that had ruled in silence for decades. But the true weight of Appalachin cannot be measured in that single day. Its legacy stretched far beyond the mud-stained suits, the grainy photographs, the denials about barbecues. Appalachin reshaped law enforcement, rewired the Mafia's culture, and changed how America understood power itself. In the simplest sense, the legacy of Appalachin is exposure. Before November of 1957, the Mafia existed in whispers. Law enforcement dismissed it, politicians downplayed it, and the FBI, under Edgar Hoover, outright denied it. The mob thrived in that vacuum of disbelief, ruling unions, industries, and neighborhoods under a shroud of invisibility. But Appalachin dragged them into daylight. The image of over 100 mobsters fleeing through fields, tripping over fences, abandoning Cadillacs in ditches. That picture shattered the myth. Ordinary Americans could no longer tell themselves the Mafia was a storybook invention. It was real. It was national. It was powerful. And it could be exposed. That exposure forced the federal government to act. Hoover's FBI, once reluctant, shifted gears. The Bureau began building files on mobsters, cultivating informants, and using wiretaps. Congress, embarrassed by the spectacle, demanded action. Appalachin became the spark that lit hearings, reports, and eventually legislation like the RICO Act, which would allow prosecutors to dismantle entire organizations rather than chase piecemeal charges. Without Appalachin, that momentum might have taken years longer to gather. Instead, the raid fast-tracked America's war on organized crime. The Mafia felt that pressure immediately. Gone were the days of grand assemblies. Gone were the careless shows of strength. Never again would bosses risk gathering in such numbers on American soil. The commission still met, but discreetly, in small groups, behind layers of intermediaries. Communication became more coded, more fragmented. Leadership grew quieter, more insulated. Carlo Gambino's rise to power after Appalachin was no coincidence. He embodied the new style of Mafia boss. Cautious, invisible, patient. Where Genovese had been brash, Gambino was subtle. Where Appalachin had exposed arrogance, Gambino's reign thrived on discretion. The legacy also lived in humiliation. For mobsters who built their reputations on fear and respect, Appalachin was an open wound. To be mocked in newspapers, to be sketched in cartoons as clumsy men running through cornfields, it stripped away a layer of mystique that could never fully be rebuilt. Respect could be commanded through violence, but dignity once lost is harder to regain. Even decades later, mobsters whispered about Appalachin as a lesson, a warning, a reminder that arrogance was dangerous and visibility was death. For law enforcement officers like Trooper Edgar Croswell, the legacy was vindication. He had trusted his instincts, followed his observations, and stumbled into history. Without his vigilance, the meeting might have passed unnoticed, its decisions shaping the underworld unchecked. Croswell became a symbol of what persistence could achieve, proof that even the smallest act of suspicion could topple the myth of invincibility. His watchful eyes helped open the door to an era where the Mafia was no longer untouchable. But the legacy of Appalachin is not just institutional, it is cultural. The raid cemented the Mafia as part of American mythology. Hollywood seized the story, weaving mobsters into films, television, and literature. The image of men in suits, cigar smoke curling in shadowy rooms, became iconic. The Mafia was both feared and glamorized, its mystique feeding pop culture for generations. Appalachin gave the public its first unfiltered glimpse of the real mob, and from that moment on, the line between reality and legend blurred. Every gangster film, every true crime book, every cultural reference to the mob carried, in some way, the shadow of Appalachin. Yet the Mafia's own legacy from that day is more complicated. They adapted, survived, even thrived in the years immediately following. They maintained their grip on unions, their control of gambling, their share of narcotics. They shifted deeper into legitimate businesses, embedding themselves in construction, waste management, shipping, and entertainment. In many ways, Appalachin taught them to become more sophisticated, more global, harder to catch. The raid did not kill the Mafia. It forced its evolution. But evolution did not erase the scars. Appalachin fractured trust within the underworld. Men who had once believed in the silence of Omerta saw cracks appear. Fear of exposure grew. The idea that the law could stumble upon them, photograph them, and humiliate them planted doubt that spread in subtle ways. Over time, those doubts made betrayal easier. When Joe Valachi broke Omerta in 1963, testifying publicly about the Mafia's structure, it felt like the next domino after Appalachin. The code of silence was already weakened by the memory of that day. Once exposed, the myth of absolute secrecy could never fully recover. The legacy also lived in politics. Apalachin embarrassed not only Hoover but entire state and federal systems. It revealed gaps in coordination, failures in recognition, blind spots that criminals had exploited for decades. The fallout spurred reforms, expanded jurisdiction for federal agencies, and fostered cooperation between state and federal law enforcement. In its own twisted way, the Mafia summit accomplished what reformers had begged for: proof strong enough to force systemic change. On a more human level, the legacy scarred the families involved. Wives saw their husbands' names smeared across front pages. Children heard whispers at school. Neighbors stared, suspicious and curious. Respect within the community was replaced by ridicule. The mob had always relied on a mixture of fear and admiration to maintain control over neighborhoods. Appalachin eroded that balance, leaving many bosses and soldiers to rebuild their reputations one shakedown at a time. And for Joseph Barbara, the host whose estate became ground zero, the legacy was ruin. His health collapsed, his business faltered, and his name became a punchline. He died in 1959, remembered less as a boss than as the man who hosted the most disastrous meeting in Mafia history. His estate, once a symbol of wealth, became a monument to humiliation. Vito Genovese, too, carried Appalachin's legacy to his grave. His dream of being crowned supreme leader was shattered, his reputation destroyed, his enemies emboldened. Within 2 years, he was imprisoned on narcotics charges, his empire crumbling from the inside. For all his ambition, for all his ruthlessness, history remembers him less as a king than as the man whose arrogance exposed an entire underworld. The Mafia would continue for decades, adapting to new laws, new technologies, new enemies. They would rise and fall through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, enduring everything from federal crackdowns to the betrayal of turncoats like Gravano. But Appalachin remained the turning point. It was the day they lost their invisibility, the day the law turned its full gaze upon them, the day the myth of untouchable kings was punctured by the reality of men running through fields. The legacy of Appalachin is not victory or defeat. It is transformation. It is the moment the Mafia became real to the world, and in becoming real, became vulnerable. It is the day the federal government awoke, the day the press feasted, the day the underworld realized that arrogance was its greatest enemy. It is a reminder that power built on secrecy can crumble when exposed to light. Even now, decades later, Appalachin lingers in the American imagination. It stands as both a cautionary tale and a cultural landmark. For law enforcement, it was the moment denial ended. For the Mafia, it was the moment invisibility died. For the public, it was the moment shadows took form. And for history, it was the day a quiet town in New York became the stage where an empire tripped, fell, and revealed itself to the world. That is the legacy of Appalachin. Not just a raid, not just a meeting, but a turning point that changed the Mafia and America forever.